There was a time, in the middle of the 12th century, when the tallest thing a Parisian could imagine was the sky itself pressing down over the river. And yet, on a small island in the middle of that river, something was about to rise that would make the sky itself seem a little closer. The island was called the Île de la Cité, a low, crowded shelf of land held in the arms of the Seine, and it was here, in the years before any stone had been cut for it, that the people of Paris began to speak of a cathedral that had no business standing as tall as it would eventually stand. Notre-Dame de Paris. The name would come to mean permanence itself, a fixed point against which centuries could be measured. But in those early years it meant only an idea, murmured in the closes and workshops of a city that did not yet know what it was about to build. It should not have been possible, according to the plain arithmetic of stone and mortar and human strength, to lift walls so high and pierce them with windows so wide and still expect them to stand for even a single winter. That was the quiet seed of it all. The sense, felt long before it could be proven, that this cathedral intended to go higher than stone had any right to go. To understand why such an ambition could take root at all, it helps to remember what stood on the island before it. For centuries there had been a church there, older and smaller and far less certain of itself. A foundation traced back to the Merovingian kings who had ruled the Franks in the earliest days after Rome's long shadow withdrew from Gaul. That earlier church, dedicated in its own time to Saint Stephen, had served the growing community of Paris in the plain and steady way that early churches did. A gathering point, a place of baptism and burial, a modest roof under which the business of faith was carried out without much thought of grandeur. Beside it, other structures had accumulated over the generations, as they tend to on old and holy ground. A smaller church, a baptistry, the scattered outbuildings of a bishopric, slowly gathering weight and consequence in the life of the city around it. By the 11th century, this cluster of buildings was already showing its age, patched and repaired as any structure inhabited for hundreds of years will be, its walls thick with the accumulated smoke of candles and the accumulated hopes of the people who had knelt inside them. It was, by every account that survives, a building suited to an older Paris, smaller, poorer, less certain of its own importance in the wider world. But the Paris that surrounded it in the 12th century was no longer that older, smaller city. It was a place waking rapidly into new wealth and new ambition, its population swelling as trade along the Seine thickened, as the roads leading into it filled with merchants and scholars and pilgrims. As the schools clustered near the cathedral began to draw students from across the length of Europe, students who would in time give Paris its university and its reputation as a capital of learning as well as commerce. The island itself had become almost impossibly crowded for its size, its narrow streets pressed close together, its houses leaning toward each other over lanes barely wide enough for two carts to pass. And yet, even amid that crowding, there was a hunger in the air that had little to do with land or money. It was a hunger felt across much of Western Europe in those decades, a restless confidence that had begun to express itself in stone, in taller windows, in longer naves, in the slow abandonment of the heavy, dim, fortress-like churches of an earlier age, in favor of something lighter, something that seemed to strain upward rather than crouch defensively against the ground. Historians would later give this shift in taste and technique a name, the Gothic, though no one living through its earliest stirrings would have called it that. They would only have said, if asked, that the old ways of building no longer seemed to answer the ambitions of the age, that a church raised in the old Romanesque manner, thick-walled and low-arched, no longer felt equal to what a city like Paris now believed itself capable of achieving in the sight of God. It is worth pausing here, before the story moves toward the specific decision that would set the new cathedral in motion, to sit for a moment inside the sensory world of that Paris. because so much of what would shape the coming cathedral was shaped first by the rhythms of the city around it. Mornings on the island began, as they had for generations, with bells. Not yet the great bells that would one day hang in western towers, not yet built, but the smaller bells of the older church and its neighboring chapels, ringing out across water and rooftops to call the canons to their offices before the sun itself had cleared the eastern rooftops. Beneath those bells, the Seine was already busy. Barges loaded with grain and wine moved along the current, poled and towed by men whose work had barely changed in 100 years. Threading past the mills that turned slowly at the river's edge, and past the fishing boats setting out before dawn to work the shallows near the banks. The air near the water carried the particular smell of a medieval river city. Mud and fish and tar, the faint sourness of tanning yards somewhere downstream, mingled with wood smoke drifting from the ovens and hearths that were just beginning to wake for the day. On the narrow streets climbing back from the water, workshops were stirring in that same grey hour. Bakers already at their ovens, smiths beginning to coax fire back into banked coals, and, closer to the church precincts, the quieter movement of masons and carpenters who worked not for shops of their own, but for the great, slow, ongoing project of maintaining and slowly expanding the buildings of the bishopric itself. It was into this world, crowded, ambitious, thick with the smell of river and wood smoke, alive with bells and barges and the murmur of a rapidly growing population, that the idea of a new cathedral began to take shape, not as a single sudden decision, but as something that seems, in the surviving record, to have grown out of necessity as much as vision. The old church on the site, however beloved, was simply no longer large enough, nor grand enough, to hold the city that had grown up around it. Paris, by the middle of the 12th century, was among the largest and wealthiest cities in Western Europe, its bishop one of the most influential churchmen in the Kingdom of France, and the modest Merovingian-era buildings clustered at the eastern end of the island had begun to feel, to anyone standing inside them on a crowded feast day, distinctly out of proportion to the city's sense of itself. There was, too, the simple pressure of rivalry, not malicious but real, as other cities and their bishops undertook similarly ambitious projects, each cathedral rising a little higher, a little wider, a little more daringly pierced with glass than the one before it, in a kind of slow, unspoken contest being carried out across the roads and rivers of northern France. Paris, as the seat of a bishop with considerable resources and considerable royal favour, was well positioned to enter that contest, and by the middle years of the 12th century, the pieces were quietly assembling themselves. A growing treasury, a city eager to see its faith made visible in stone, and, waiting only to be summoned, an idea of what a truly new kind of church might look like once someone dared to commission it. None of this happened quickly, and none of it happened without doubt. The building that would eventually rise on the island was not simply willed into existence by ambition alone. It required money that had to be gathered gradually, materials that had to be sourced and tested, and above all, it required a decision, a specific, dated act of commitment by which the old buildings would begin to be cleared away and a new foundation begun in their place. That decision, and the man who made it, belong to the next part of this chronicle. But it is worth sitting for a moment longer in the years just before it, in the ordinary, unremarkable Paris that had no way of knowing what was about to be summoned onto its small, crowded island. The canons who served the old church went about their daily offices unaware that within a matter of years they would be worshipping amid falling dust and standing scaffolding. The masons and carpenters who worked on the ordinary maintenance of the bishopric's buildings had no reason yet to imagine that some among them, or their sons, would spend the whole of their working lives on a single vast project that would not be finished within any one lifetime. And the ordinary citizens of Paris, the bakers and boatmen and tanners and students crowding into the schools near the cathedral close, carried on with their mornings of bells and river fog and wood smoke, unaware that the skyline they woke to each day was about to begin, slowly and almost imperceptibly at first, to change. It is here, in this quiet before the decision, that this long chronicle properly begins. Not with the fire that would one day threaten to take the cathedral from the world, nor with the towers or the spire, or the great rose windows that would come to define it in the imagination of centuries, but with a river city on the edge of transformation, still innocent of what it was about to build. For those who wish to sit with this story at its own pace, letting each stage of the cathedral's long life unfold as slowly as it actually happened. The ambition, the ground, the stone, the seasons of labor, the fire, and the long work of rebuilding. There is a gentle invitation here to settle in, to let the mind rest into the rhythm of the telling. And, if it is of interest, to follow along for more chronicles of this kind in the time to come. What follows is not a story that hurries. It moves the way the cathedral itself moved, stone by stone, season by season, across generations who would begin work they knew they would not live to see completed. The decision that set all of this in motion did not come from the masons or the carpenters, and it did not come from the ordinary citizens of the island, however much their hopes and their labor would eventually be poured into the building. It came, as such decisions so often did in that century, from a single figure of considerable will and considerable vision, a bishop who looked at the aging, overcrowded church at the heart of his diocese and decided that Paris deserved and required something far greater than what already stood there. It is to that bishop, and to the ambition he carried into the councils of the church and the treasury of his diocese, that this chronicle now turns, for it was his decision, made amid the bells and river fog of a city not yet aware of its own coming transformation, that would summon Notre-Dame de Paris into being. The man who would summon this transformation was named Maurice de Sully, and the records that survive of him are, in the way of many medieval churchmen, thin in personal detail and rich only in the outline of his deeds. He was born, so far as the fragmentary accounts allow, of humble origin in the region of the Loire, a man who rose through the church not by inherited privilege, but by the slow accumulation of learning and reputation, until by the middle years of the 12th century he had ascended to the bishopric of Paris itself, one of the most consequential seats in the Kingdom of France. He inherited, upon his elevation, a cathedral that had served the city for centuries, but that had long since ceased to match the ambitions of the see it represented. That older church, dedicated like its successor to the Virgin, stood on the same island in the river where the new cathedral would eventually rise, and it had itself replaced still earlier structures reaching back, according to some accounts, to the very foundations of Christian worship in the city. But by the time Maurice de Sully took up his office, this older building was, by every surviving description, too small, too dim, and too plain for the city that Paris had become. Paris in the middle of the 12th century was a place transforming itself, with a speed that must have felt, to those living through it, almost dizzying. The population was swelling. The schools that would one day become the university were drawing scholars from across the continent to argue theology and logic in the streets around the cathedral close. The kings of France, whose power had for generations been more theoretical than real beyond the immediate vicinity of their own estates, were beginning to draw the threads of royal authority more tightly around the city, making Paris not merely one town among many, but increasingly the political and spiritual heart of the kingdom. Against this backdrop of growth and ambition, the old cathedral seemed, to Bishop Maurice and to those who shared his vision, an embarrassment, a building unworthy of the destiny the city seemed to be claiming for itself. It would be a mistake, though, to imagine that Maurice de Sully acted alone. or that his ambitions sprang from personal vanity untethered from the currents of his age. He was, in this, very much a man of his century, for the decades in which he came to office were years in which a new architectural language was spreading across the north of France, a style not yet called Gothic, since that name would be applied by later critics as something of an insult before it was ever worn with pride, but recognized even then as something distinct from what had come before. Pointed arches were replacing the heavy, rounded forms of earlier centuries. Ribbed vaulting was allowing builders to direct the weight of stone ceilings down through slender points rather than massive walls. And with these innovations came, gradually and then, with increasing confidence, the possibility of a kind of building that had simply not existed before, a building that could rise higher, admit more light, and seem, to those who stood beneath its vaults, to defy the very weight of the material from which it was made. This new manner of building had already begun to appear at the Royal Abbey not far from Paris, where an influential abbot had rebuilt his own church in the new style and left behind writings that described his ambitions in terms that could scarcely be called modest, speaking of light and radiance as though the stone itself might be made to glow. Maurice de Sully, whether or not he had studied those particular writings closely, could hardly have escaped the currents of enthusiasm and experimentation moving through the churchmen and builders of his generation. There was also, running beneath the pious language of devotion, a current of something closer to civic and ecclesiastical rivalry, though the chroniclers of the age were careful, for the most part, to frame it in terms of glory given to God rather than glory claimed for a city. Other bishops in other towns across the north of France were, in these same decades, beginning or continuing their own great rebuilding projects, each cathedral rising a little taller, each nave stretching a little longer, each west front reaching toward the sky with towers that seemed to compete, however unspoken the competition may have been in official pronouncements, with the ambitions of neighboring dioceses. To build modestly in such an environment was itself a kind of statement, and not necessarily a flattering one, about the wealth, piety, and standing of a bishop and his see. Paris, as the city increasingly understood itself to be the true seat of the French crown, could not easily accept a cathedral smaller or humbler than those rising elsewhere. Whether Maurice de Sully felt this pressure as a burden or embraced it as an opportunity, the surviving record does not say with certainty, but the scale of what he set in motion suggests a man who intended not merely to keep pace with his rivals, but to surpass them. The reasons behind the undertaking, then, were braided together in a way that resists easy separation. There was faith, sincere and deeply felt, the conviction that a structure of sufficient grandeur might serve as a fitting vessel for the sacred, a place where the boundary between the earthly and the divine could be made, through stone and light, to feel thinner than it did elsewhere. There was civic pride, the sense that Paris, growing in population and royal favor, required a cathedral equal to its ambitions. And there was, less nobly perhaps, but no less powerfully, the simple human desire to build something that would outlast its builders, to leave behind a mark upon the world that no fire, no war, and no passage of years could easily erase. These motives did not compete so much as reinforce one another, each lending urgency to the others, until the project that emerged was understood by everyone involved, from the bishop down to the humblest laborer who would eventually carry stone to the site, as something considerably larger than the replacement of an aging building. The symbolic weight that came to rest upon the planned cathedral, even before a single stone had been laid, was considerable. It was to be, first and plainly, a house for relics, for the medieval church placed enormous spiritual value in physical remnants of the sacred, and a cathedral of sufficient grandeur was expected to serve as a worthy setting for such treasures, drawing pilgrims whose devotion and whose offerings would in turn sustain the life of the church for generations to come. It was also, from the very outset, understood as a stage, in the most literal sense, for the great ceremonies of both church and state. Coronations, councils, the solemn gatherings of bishops and princes, the public rituals through which the authority of crown and church renewed itself in the eyes of the populace, all of these required a setting of sufficient dignity, and the old cathedral, cramped and modest, could not provide it. Maurice de Sully understood, as clearly as any patron of his age, that a building of this kind was never merely a place of private devotion. It was a public instrument, a stage upon which the drama of medieval society, its hierarchies, its alliances, its claims to legitimacy, would be performed for centuries after its founder had returned to the earth. And there was, beyond even these considerations, a simpler and more human ambition at work, the desire to build something that would outlast every hand that raised it. This was, in the medieval understanding of such projects, not vanity so much as a kind of humility turned inside out, an acknowledgement that no single lifetime, no single bishop's tenure, however long, could possibly see such a building, through from foundation to completion. Maurice de Sully, whatever hopes he may have harbored, could not have expected to witness the finished cathedral himself. And in this, he was not unusual among the great patrons of his age. To begin such a project was to accept, from the very first ceremonial gesture, that the work belonged not to oneself, but to a chain of successors, masons, bishops, kings and craftsmen yet unborn, who would each add their portion to a structure whose completion lay generations in the future. This was, in its way, an act of considerable faith, not merely religious faith in the narrow sense, but faith in the persistence of human institutions, in the willingness of strangers not yet born to finish what one had only begun. Not everyone, it must be said, greeted this ambition with unclouded enthusiasm. The record of dissent from this particular period is thin, as such records so often are, since it was rarely the skeptics whose words were carefully preserved by the scribes of triumphant institutions. But scattered references survive, in the writings of contemporaries and near-contemporaries describing similar projects elsewhere, to voices that questioned whether stone could truly be persuaded to behave in the manner the new architecture demanded. Walls were to rise higher than walls had commonly risen before, pierced by windows larger than windows had commonly been cut before, and all of this was to be achieved not through sheer mass, the traditional guarantor of stability in stone construction, but through a more delicate calculation of forces, an intricate balance of thrust and counter-thrust in which flying buttresses and ribbed vaults would carry weight along paths that the eye could not always easily trace. To some observers of the age, steeped in older traditions of building, this must have seemed less like engineering than like a kind of dare directed at the laws of gravity itself. Could light truly be reconciled with stability? Could height be pursued without inviting collapse? These were not idle questions, for examples were not entirely lacking in the decades and generations that followed the rise of the new style, of ambitious towers and vaults that failed, sometimes catastrophically, when the calculations of their builders proved less sound than their aspirations. Maurice de Sully and the masters he would eventually gather around him were, in this sense, engaged in something genuinely uncertain, a wager against the accumulated wisdom of centuries of more conservative building. And it would have taken a confident temperament indeed to enter into that wager without at least a private moment of doubt. It is this quality, this patient, deliberate confidence undergirded by genuine risk, that sets the tone for everything that follows in the long chronicle of Notre-Dame's construction. There was no single instant of triumphant certainty, no moment in which all doubts were resolved and the outcome guaranteed. There was, instead, a slow accumulation of decisions, each one committing the project a little further, each one narrowing the possibility of retreat, until the cathedral's eventual completion became not a foregone conclusion, but the hard-won result of decades of accumulated labor, faith, and stubborn persistence in the face of considerable uncertainty. This patient ambition, this willingness to commit to a project whose end no living participant could foresee, would carry the work forward through the setbacks, the funding crises, the changes of bishops and kings, and the slow, seasonal rhythm of construction that would define the coming century. And so it was that, without any fanfare that the surviving records thought worth preserving, without trumpets or great crowds gathered to witness the moment, the first ceremonial stone of the new cathedral was set into the ground in the year 1163. The chroniclers, who might have recorded the scene in vivid detail, left instead only the bare fact of the date and the occasion, a modesty of documentation that seems, in retrospect, entirely fitting for a project whose true grandeur would reveal itself, not in a single gesture but across the slow unfolding of generations. The stone was laid, the ground was marked, and the long work of building Notre-Dame de Paris had, quietly and without ceremony, equal to its ultimate consequence, begun. No one recorded the name of the man who first drew the plan for Notre-Dame de Paris. This absence is not an accident of lost archives, not a gap that some future discovery might fill, but a reflection of how the great cathedrals of this era came into being at all. The masters who conceived the vast geometries of vault and span, who decided how high a wall might rise before it needed the support of a buttress, who calculated the angle at which a rib should meet its neighbor, to distribute the weight of stone into a network of forces rather than a single crushing burden, worked largely outside the reach of written history. They were not celebrated in the way that later architects would be celebrated, their names inscribed on cornerstones or remembered in the dedications of grateful patrons. They were craftsmen first, and their authority came not from titles or commissions recorded in careful ledgers, but from what their hands and eyes had learned across years of apprenticeship, travel, and quiet observation of stone under strain. This is not to say that the design of Notre-Dame emerged from nowhere, or that its makers worked in isolation from the currents of thought moving through their age. Quite the opposite. The pointed arch and the ribbed vault, the two technical innovations that would come to define the Gothic style, and that Notre-Dame would carry to new heights, had already begun appearing in smaller forms in the churches and cathedrals that preceded it. What is remarkable is not that these innovations appeared, but how they appeared, not as sudden inventions credited to a single brilliant mind, but as calm technical revelations arrived at gradually, tested in one building, refined in the next, carried forward by masons who moved from site to site, and carried with them not blueprints in the modern sense, but something closer to lived knowledge, a physical memory of how stone behaved when asked to do something new. The pointed arch itself illustrates this process well. Earlier builders, working in the Romanesque tradition that Notre-Dame's masters had inherited and would soon surpass, had relied on the rounded arch, a form both ancient and reliable, but limited in the height and light it could permit. A rounded arch, spanning a wide distance, pushes outward with tremendous force at its base, demanding thick walls and small windows to resist the thrust. The pointed arch, by contrast, directs its weight more steeply downward, concentrating the load in a way that allows the walls beneath it to be thinner, the openings within them larger, the whole structure to reach higher without collapsing under its own ambition. No single builder is credited with discovering this principle. It emerged instead through a slow accumulation of trial, observation, and adjustment across dozens of building sites in the decades before Notre-Dame's first stone was set. A discovery made not in a moment of inspiration, but through the patient, repeated labor of men whose names have not survived to receive the credit. The ribbed vault followed a similar path. where earlier stone ceilings had been built as continuous barrel vaults, heavy and unbroken, demanding walls thick enough to bear their entire weight along every inch of their length. The ribbed vault divided that weight into distinct channels, arched stone ribs that gathered the load at specific points and carried it down to specific piers, leaving the spaces between the ribs to be filled with lighter, thinner stone that bore comparatively little burden. This division of labor within the very structure of the ceiling was, again, not a single insight, but a gradual refinement, one that masons had been testing and adjusting in cathedral after cathedral, each generation learning a little more about how far the technique could be pushed, where it might fail, and how its failures could be corrected in the next attempt. Knowledge of this kind did not travel through treatises or formal instruction in the way that engineering knowledge would later be recorded and taught. There were no comprehensive manuals explaining the mathematics of thrust and load, no academies where a student might study the physics of stone before laying a single block. Instead, this knowledge passed from master to apprentice, hand to hand, through years of watching, of cutting stone under supervision, of gradually being trusted with more delicate and consequential work. A young man entering the trade might spend a decade or more simply learning to shape stone correctly before he was permitted to make decisions about how that stone should be placed within a larger design. The guilds that organized this labor were not merely economic associations protecting wages and standards, though they were certainly that as well. They were also the vessels through which an entire body of accumulated technical wisdom was preserved and transmitted, generation to generation, without ever being written down in any systematic way. Drawings existed, certainly, though few survive from this earliest period of Gothic building. Masons worked from templates, from tracings scratched into plaster floors or drawn on parchment, from small-scale models that helped them visualize how a design might translate into stone at full size. But these drawings were tools of the craft rather than records for posterity, consumed in the working of the building itself, revised and discarded as the design evolved, never intended to survive as monuments to their own creation. What was preserved was not the paper, but the practice, the physical skill embedded in the bodies of the men who possessed it, passed forward not through libraries but through living chains of instruction that stretched back, master to apprentice, for generations before Notre-Dame was ever conceived. It would be a mistake, though, to imagine the masters of this era as isolated figures, each working in solitary ignorance of what was happening elsewhere. The opposite was true. The decades surrounding the founding of Notre-Dame were a period of extraordinary movement and exchange among the cathedral towns of northern France. A quiet contest played out, not in war or commerce, but in height, in light, in the audacity of stone. Chartres, to the southwest of Paris, had already begun work on its own great cathedral, its masters experimenting with proportions and vaulting techniques that would influence builders across the region. Lyon, to the north, was raising a cathedral whose innovations in the handling of interior space and structural rhythm were closely watched by masons from other towns who traveled, sometimes considerable distances, simply to observe what was being attempted. Reims, not yet begun in the form the world would later know, was nonetheless part of this same network of watching and learning, its future builders drawing on lessons that were, even then, being worked out in the stone of neighboring towns. This rivalry was not hostile in the way that word might suggest today. It was, instead, a shared ambition expressed through competition. Each town's bishop and chapter eager to see their own cathedral rise higher, admit more light, achieve some technical grace that the others had not yet mastered, while at the same time depending on the very same pool of traveling masons, the very same slowly accumulating body of Gothic knowledge, to make such ambitions possible at all. A master mason who had worked on the vaulting at one site might, a few years later, find himself contributing to the design of another, carrying with him not blueprints, but understanding, an internalized sense of what had worked and what had not, what dangers a particular technique concealed, and how those dangers might be avoided the second time. In this way, the cathedrals of this era were less a collection of separate monuments than a single distributed conversation carried out in stone across an entire region, each building responding to and building upon the others. The masters themselves, the living threads connecting one great work to the next. What is known of Notre-Dame's earliest design comes to us not through any surviving plan or written specification from its first masters, but through the physical evidence of the building itself, supplemented by what modern architectural historians have been able to reconstruct through careful study of its earliest surviving portions. The design called for a nave of unusual length, longer than most cathedrals attempted at the time, a decision that would demand extraordinary confidence in the structural techniques being employed, since a longer nave meant a greater span to be vaulted, a greater weight to be supported, a greater test of whether the still developing principles of Gothic construction could bear the ambition being placed upon them. The design also called for a double ambulatory, a feature that would set Notre-Dame apart from many of its contemporaries. Not one but two curved aisles wrapping around the choir at the building's eastern end, doubling the sense of spaciousness and procession for those who would walk that path, and doubling as well the structural complexity that the masters would need to resolve. Perhaps most significantly, though this would not become fully apparent until later in the building's construction, the earliest design appears to have anticipated, even if it did not yet fully trust, the eventual need for flying buttresses, those external arms of stone that would, in later decades, reach out from the upper walls of the cathedral to counter the outward thrust of the vaults above, allowing the walls themselves to become thinner and the windows within them larger than had ever before been achieved on this scale. The full realization of the flying buttress as a defining feature of Notre-Dame's exterior would not arrive with the first stones. It would emerge, like so much else in this story, gradually as the masters building upward discovered, sometimes through unwelcome experience, the limits of what their walls could bear without additional support. But the seeds of that solution, the beginning of an understanding that such support would eventually be required, seem to have been present even in the earliest conception of the building, a quiet acknowledgement that the ambitions being set into stone exceeded, in certain respects, what could yet be fully guaranteed by the techniques available to achieve them. This is perhaps the most striking aspect of Notre-Dame's beginning, the sense that its design was not a fixed and finished thing, handed down complete from some singular moment of conception, but rather a living plan, still evolving even as the first courses of stone were being laid into the ground. The masters who began the work did not possess certainty in the way that later engineers, armed with calculations and tested formulas, would possess certainty. They possessed instead experience, judgment, and a willingness to adjust their approach as the building itself began to reveal, level by level, what it could and could not bear. Decisions made in the choir might be revised by the time the nave was reached. Techniques tested in the lower walls might be refined before they were applied to the towers. The cathedral that would eventually stand complete, its silhouette recognizable across centuries, was not built according to a single unchanging vision, but discovered gradually by masters whose names have not survived, through the patient, iterative process of building itself, a process in which every stone laid taught something to the stones that would follow, and in which the anonymous hands doing the laying were, in their quiet and unrecorded way, among the most consequential architects Europe would ever know. Before any of that patient teaching could occur, before a single course of visible stone could rise to catch the light of the Ile de la Cité, there was a problem that no mason's skill, and no architect's vision could resolve through cleverness alone. The ground itself had to be reckoned with, and the ground beneath Paris was not the kind of ground that welcomed towers. The island on which the cathedral would stand had been shaped across thousands of years by the patient work of the Seine. The river had deposited layer upon layer of silt and sand and clay, alluvial soil carried down from farther upstream and laid to rest wherever the current slowed, wherever the water found a place to release what it carried. This was not bedrock. It was not the kind of stable, ancient stone that might be found beneath the hill towns of the countryside, where a foundation could be cut directly into living rock and trusted to hold. The Ile de la Cité was, in a sense, still becoming solid ground, even as the builders arrived to build upon it, a place where the boundary between river and land had always been provisional, always subject to negotiation. This was not unknown to the people of Paris in the 12th century. They had lived beside the Seine for generations, had watched it flood and recede, had built their houses and their earlier churches upon this same uncertain earth, and they carried in their collective memory a kind of inherited caution about what the ground could and could not be asked to bear. But a cathedral was not a house. A cathedral was not even the earlier church that had stood on this site before it. Modest by comparison, its walls rising only to heights that soft ground could comfortably support without complaint. What Bishop Maurice de Sully and his masters intended was something the island had never been asked to carry before. Towers that would eventually reach toward the sky with a mass measured not in the weight of a family dwelling, but in the accumulated weight of an entire quarried hillside, concentrated into piers and walls that would press down upon this same uncertain silt with a force that could, if misjudged, cause the whole structure to settle unevenly, to crack, to lean, to fail not dramatically in a single collapse, but slowly over years. As one section of the building sank faster than another, and the stone above began to answer that sinking with fractures no mortar could disguise. And so, before there could be a nave, before there could be transepts or a choir or towers, there had to be trenches. The first work of the cathedral was not masonry rising into light, but excavation descending into darkness. Laborers with picks and shovels cutting down through the soft upper layers of the island's soil, searching for something firmer beneath, some stratum of compacted earth or gravel that might offer more resistance than the loose alluvial deposits closer to the surface. This work would have proceeded without the fanfare that later attended the raising of the West Front, without the crowds that would gather to watch a tower take shape against the sky. It was work performed in pits, in trenches that filled with groundwater as quickly as they were dug, in conditions that offered no visible reward for the labor expended, no rising silhouette to mark progress, only deeper darkness and the persistent seep of the river, finding its way back into every excavation cut too close to its banks. The trenches, once dug to whatever depth the masters judged sufficient, were not simply built upon directly. They were packed, filled with rubble, with broken stone, with whatever solid material could be gathered and compressed into the excavated space, bound together with mortar, poured to fill the gaps between the fragments and, in settling and hardening, to bind the whole mass into something more continuous than a mere pile of stone. This was the foundation in its truest sense. Not a single carved block, but an assembled mattress of rubble and mortar, built up in layers within the trench until it reached a level the masters judged capable of receiving the first true courses of dressed stone above. The patience required for this work is difficult to overstate, and it is a patience that modern methods of construction, with their soil tests and load calculations performed before a single trench is opened, can make it easy to forget was ever necessary. The masters of the 12th century did not know, in any quantifiable sense, how much weight the packed rubble beneath their feet could bear. There was no instrument to measure it, no formula to calculate it, no engineering literature to consult that had reduced the behavior of soil under compression to numbers that could be trusted across different sites and different soils. What existed instead was accumulated experience, the memory of what had worked and what had failed in earlier buildings, passed from master to apprentice, from one generation of builders to the next, an oral and practical inheritance rather than a written science. A master mason approaching the foundations of Notre-Dame would have carried within him the memory of other foundations, other soils, other buildings that had settled well or settled badly. And from that memory, he would have drawn his judgment about how deep to dig, how thoroughly to pack the rubble, how long to wait before trusting the ground to receive the first visible walls. And there would have been waiting. This is perhaps the aspect of medieval foundation work most foreign to a modern sensibility accustomed to speed, to the assumption that the moment a foundation is poured, construction may proceed immediately above it. The builders of the 12th century understood, from experience if not from theory, that freshly packed rubble and mortar needed time to settle, time for the material to compress under its own weight and find its natural resting density before additional weight was added above it. To build too quickly upon foundations not yet settled was to invite exactly the kind of uneven sinking that could doom a structure years later, when cracks began to appear in walls that had seemed, at the time of their construction, entirely sound. So the early courses of foundation stone were laid, and then, in all likelihood, the work above them proceeded slowly, deliberately, with pauses that allowed the masters to observe whether the ground beneath was answering the new weight with any visible sign of distress. A settling crack, an uneven line, some indication that the earth was protesting the burden being placed upon it. This process of observation and adjustment, rather than calculation and certainty, was the closest the age came to what might now be called soil science. There was no laboratory analysis of the alluvial deposits beneath the Ile de la Cité, no measurement of bearing capacity expressed in the language of modern engineering. There was only trial, conducted at the scale of the actual building, with the actual stone under the actual conditions of the actual site. A trial in which failure, had it occurred, would not have been a discarded test result, but a catastrophe measured in collapsed walls and possibly lost lives. The masters who dug those trenches and packed that rubble were, in every meaningful sense, running an experiment whose result would only be known with certainty decades later, when the completed cathedral either stood serene above its foundations or began, slowly and irreversibly, to show the signs of a foundation inadequate to its burden. The documentary record of this earliest phase of work is, unfortunately, thin in ways that frustrate the historian's wish for certainty. No detailed account survives describing precisely how deep the trenches were carried. Before the masters judged the ground sufficiently prepared, no ledger records the exact composition of the rubble packed into those early excavations. No contemporary voice describes the moment when the decision was made to trust the earth and begin building upward in earnest. What survives instead are fragments, later excavations conducted during restoration work in subsequent centuries, brief archaeological notes made when repairs required cutting into the ground near the cathedral's base, occasional references in chronicles that mention the foundations only in passing, as background to some other event being recorded. From these fragments, historians and archaeologists have pieced together an approximate understanding of how the footings were constructed. But much remains inference rather than certainty, a reconstruction built from scattered evidence rather than a complete and continuous record. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the footings were carried down to a depth the masters judged necessary to reach past the least stable surface layers. Though the precise depth likely varied across the building's footprint, deeper beneath the points destined to carry the greatest concentrated loads. the piers that would eventually rise into towers, the crossing where the greatest weight of stone would converge, and shallower beneath sections of wall where the burden to be carried was comparatively modest. This variation itself reflects a kind of practical wisdom, an intuitive grasp of load distribution achieved without the mathematical apparatus that would later formalize such calculations, but achieved nonetheless through the accumulated sense of experienced builders who had learned, through the buildings that came before, where the ground needed to be trusted more and where it might be trusted less. There is something worth pausing over in this quiet uncertainty, this reliance on judgment rather than proof, because it created a vulnerability that would remain invisible for centuries, buried beneath the rising walls and unnoticed by the millions who would eventually walk across the cathedral's floor without a thought for what lay beneath their feet. Every building carries within it the conditions of its own founding, and Notre-Dame's foundations, however carefully judged by the standards of their age, were nonetheless a wager, a bet placed by builders who could not fully verify their own calculations, resting a monument meant to endure for centuries upon soil that had never been asked to bear such weight before, and whose true capacity would only be confirmed, if it was confirmed at all, by the slow passage of time and the absence of catastrophe. This vulnerability, this quiet dependence on ground that could never be entirely known, would echo forward across 8 centuries, present in every subsequent test the cathedral faced, every settling that had to be monitored, every later repair that required excavation near the base, and revealed to modern eyes equipped with modern instruments just how much had been left to faith and experience in that original 12th century work. But on the island itself, in the years when this earliest labor was underway, none of that distant future could have been imagined by the men digging trenches and packing rubble into darkness. They worked with what they knew, trusted what experience had taught them, and proceeded with the patience the ground demanded, rather than the speed a more impatient age might have wished for. And gradually, course by course, the foundation trenches were filled and packed and left to settle, and then filled again with the first true footings of dressed stone, laid carefully atop the rubble beneath, until at last the ground had done what it needed to do and disappeared. The first courses of foundation stone, the product of so much unseen labor and unrecorded judgment, vanished beneath the rising walls that would climb above them, unseen thereafter by any eye that would not deliberately excavate to find them again, untested by anything but time itself, carrying upon their buried surfaces a weight that would only grow heavier as the seasons passed, and the cathedral, unaware of the ground's own uncertainty, began its slow ascent toward the sky. Beneath the city that would one day rise around the cathedral, and beneath the cathedral itself, lay a stone that Paris had always known intimately, though it had rarely thought to name it. The limestone of the Paris basin had been forming for tens of millions of years. Laid down when a warm and shallow sea had covered the region, its waters slowly depositing the calcareous sediments that would, over unimaginable spans of time, compress into the pale, workable stone that gave the city its complexion. It was a stone the Parisians had already been quarrying for generations before the cathedral was ever conceived, cut from pits and galleries that spread beneath the ground in a growing lattice of tunnels and chambers, hollowing out spaces that would, centuries later, be adapted and extended for railways, for cellars, for the ossuaries that would eventually receive the bones of the dead when the city's cemeteries could no longer hold them. The same ground that would one day carry the rumble of the metro beneath the streets of Paris had already, in the 12th century, given up its substance for the walls of Notre-Dame, and the two would exist afterward in a strange, unremarked relationship. The quarries becoming voids, and the voids becoming infrastructure, the stone above continuing to stand while the earth beneath it was slowly, carefully emptied. The quarries lay in several places around the growing city, some close enough that the stone could be moved with a modest effort, others further out, requiring longer journeys over roads that were, by the standards of the 12th century, adequate for cartage but far from swift. The stone itself was not uniform. Even within the region, the limestone varied in hardness, in colour, in the fineness of its grain, and the masons who selected it for cathedral work had, by long practice, learned to distinguish between beds that would carve cleanly and beds that would crumble under the chisel, between stone that would weather well against rain and frost, and stone that would soften and spall within a few decades of exposure. This knowledge was not written down in any treatise that survives. It lived instead in the hands and eyes of the men who worked the quarries and the men who received the stone at the building site. A body of practical understanding passed from master to apprentice in the same quiet, undocumented way that so much of the cathedral's construction knowledge travelled forward through the generations. The finer stone, the kind that could bear the sharp definition of a carved figure, or the crisp edge of a moulding, was reserved for the visible faces of the building, for the portals and the galleries where the eye would linger. The rougher stone, less particular in its texture, went into the cores of the walls, into the rubble fill between outer faces, into places where strength mattered more than beauty, and where no one would ever see the stone's true character again once the work had closed around it. Cutting the stone from the quarry was itself a considerable undertaking, requiring a different set of skills from the carving that would later be done at the cathedral site. Quarrymen worked with picks, wedges and levers, following the natural bedding planes of the rock where they could, exploiting the stone's own tendency to part along certain lines rather than fighting against its grain. Where the stone resisted, they drove wooden wedges into fissures and soaked them with water, trusting the slow, patient swelling of the wood to do the work that brute force could not. Once a block had been freed from the quarry face, it was roughly dressed on site, squared enough to be handled and transported without excessive waste, though the final, precise dressing that would give it its finished form was usually left for skilled masons closer to or at the building site itself, men who could shape the stone according to the specific requirements of wherever it was destined to sit within the rising structure. Moving the stone from quarry to cathedral was a labour that depended heavily on the Seine. Paris in the 12th century, like most great building projects of its era, understood that water was the most economical means of moving enormous weight across distance, far more efficient than any cart or sledge could manage over the rutted and uneven roads of the period. Quarries situated near the river or near streams that fed into it could load their dressed blocks onto barges, flat-bottomed vessels built for exactly this kind of heavy, unglamorous cargo, and let the current and the labour of boatmen carry the stone downstream toward the island where the cathedral was rising. The barges moved slowly, heavy with their burden, poled and guided by men who knew the river's moods, its shallows, its occasional treachery when rains swelled the current or when ice thickened along its edges in the depths of winter. At the building site itself, the stone was unloaded at wharves constructed for the purpose, hauled up from the water's edge by means of cranes, pulleys, and the simple, relentless effort of human and animal labour, and stacked in yards where it would wait, sometimes for a considerable time, until the masons above were ready to receive it. This slow river of material, moving block by block along the Seine, was not a dramatic spectacle. No single barge carried enough stone to transform the skyline overnight. The process was cumulative, an accretion of small deliveries that only over years and decades amounted to the tens of thousands of tons that the finished cathedral would eventually require. It was the kind of labour that left little trace in the chronicles, which tended to record the grand moments, the consecrations and the miracles, rather than the daily grind of barge traffic and stone unloading that made those grand moments possible. Yet it was this daily grind, repeated across thousands of days, that actually built the cathedral, far more than any single act of vision or patronage. The bishop's ambition had set the work in motion, but it was the boatmen and the quarrymen and the haulers at the wharves who carried that ambition, quite literally, into physical form. While the stone gathered at the riverside, another material was being drawn from a different part of the French landscape entirely, and this material would, in time, come to be known by a name that carried its own quiet reverence: the forest. The roof of the cathedral, rising above the stone vaults that would themselves take generations to complete, required an immense timber frame, a structure of oak beams and rafters interlocking in a complex carpentry that would support the lead sheathing above and protect the stonework below from rain and snow. The oak came from the forests of the wider region, from woodlands that had been managed in some fashion for generations, though the scale of the cathedral's demand was such that a very great number of trees were required, felled and hauled and shaped into the beams that would eventually be assembled above the vaults. Estimates that have circulated for generations, repeated by guides and historians without any single documented count to confirm them precisely, have suggested that the timber frame required the wood of many thousands of trees, an oak forest's worth of trunks converted into the hidden latticework of the roof. The exact figure is not something the surviving records establish with certainty, and different assessments across the centuries have arrived at different totals. But the general truth beneath the estimate is not in serious doubt. The roof frame represented an extraordinary consumption of mature oak, timber that had itself taken generations to grow before it was ever felled for the cathedral's purpose. The choice of oak was not arbitrary, and neither was the choice of the limestone that formed the walls. Both materials reflected a long inheritance of practical knowledge about what worked, tested across generations of building in the region and across the wider tradition of cathedral construction that had been developing throughout France and beyond for the better part of a century, by the time Notre-Dame's own construction began. Limestone was abundant beneath the city itself, requiring no long overland haul from distant provinces, and it had already proven, in the older churches and fortifications of the region, that it could bear weight and resist weather for a very long span of years. Oak, similarly, had a long history in ecclesiastical construction, valued for its strength, its density, and its resistance to decay when properly seasoned and protected from standing water, qualities that made it the preferred timber for roof frames across a great many of the era's most ambitious buildings. There was, in other words, very little experimentation in the choice of materials. The builders of Notre-Dame were drawing on a deep well of accumulated trust, a confidence built not through any single triumphant proof, but through generation after generation of church builders who had used these same materials, encountered their limitations, learned their behaviors, and passed that learning forward until it became, by the 12th century, simply the obvious way to build something meant to endure. Binding the stone together required its own quiet chemistry, one that unfolded not in the dramatic light of the quarry or the wharf, but in the comparatively unremarkable setting of the lime kiln. Mortar for cathedral construction was made from lime, produced by burning limestone at high temperatures in kilns until it broke down chemically, releasing carbon dioxide and leaving behind a caustic material called quicklime. This quicklime was then slaked with water, a process that had to be handled with some care given the considerable heat the reaction generated, and the resulting substance, once properly slaked and allowed to mature, formed the basis of the lime putty or lime mortar that masons would mix with sand, and sometimes other additives to create the binding paste that held stone to stone throughout the structure. The kilns themselves were simple in construction, but demanding in operation, requiring sustained high temperatures over many hours. Fed continuously with fuel, watched carefully by men who understood, again through practical experience rather than written formula. When the burn had proceeded far enough, and when the lime was ready to be drawn from the kiln and prepared for use. This was slow work, unglamorous work, the kind that never appears in any romantic account of cathedral building, but without which no stone would have remained fixed to any other stone for more than a season. The mortar produced through this process was not in truth an especially strong bonding agent by later standards. Medieval lime mortar was comparatively soft, slow to cure, and dependent as much on the careful cutting and fitting of the stones themselves. The precision with which one block sat upon another, as on any great adhesive strength in the paste between them. The true strength of the cathedral's masonry lay less in the mortar than in the sheer mass and careful jointing of the stone, the mortar serving mainly to bed the blocks evenly, to fill small irregularities, and to prevent water from finding easy paths between courses, rather than to hold the structure together through tensile strength alone. It was a quiet, patient chemistry, unfolding over the weeks and months that mortar took to carbonate and harden fully, drawing carbon dioxide back from the air in a slow reversal of the very process that had freed it from the limestone in the kiln. A cycle of transformation that mirrored, in its way, the whole patient rhythm of the cathedral's construction. By the time all of this had been gathered, sorted, and prepared, the riverside yards near the building site had come to hold considerable stacks of dressed and partly dressed stone, blocks squared and shaped according to their eventual purpose, some destined for the plain strength of a wall core, and others carrying already, even in their rough state, the faint suggestion of the mouldings and carvings they would eventually become. The stacks grew and diminished, and grew again as barges arrived, and masons drew from the supply, an inventory in constant, unhurried motion. Timber, too, had begun to accumulate nearby. Oak beams and balks set aside to season, their eventual assembly into the great roof frame still years away. None of it, taken individually, looked like a cathedral. It was simply material, patient and inert, waiting at the edge of the river for the shape that had not yet been given to it. A shape that existed, for the time being, only in the minds of the masters who would soon begin to raise it, course by course, into the sky. The work, when it finally began to rise above the level of the foundations, did not rise quickly, and no one who watched it in those first years expected that it would. A cathedral was not built the way a house was built, in a season or two, with the family moving in before the first frost. It was built the way a forest grows, imperceptibly, so that a man might walk past the site every day of his working life, and still struggle to say, with certainty, how much taller the walls had become since his youth. The scaffolding was the first sign that the ground had surrendered, its long quiet to something larger. Timber poles were lashed together with rope in patterns that had been refined over generations of church building elsewhere in the kingdom. Platforms rising in tiers alongside the thickening walls. Each level added only once. The one below it had proven itself steady under the weight of stone, mortar, and men. There were no engines in the modern sense, no steam, no motors, nothing but the patient conversion of human and animal effort into lift. The treadwheel hoist did this work at the heart of the site. A great wooden drum turned from the inside by one or two labourers walking within it, as though inside a wheel built for a creature far larger than themselves. Their steady tread translating, through rope and pulley, into the slow ascent of a stone block that might otherwise have taken a dozen men straining at ropes to raise by hand alone. The wheel groaned as it turned. The rope creaked under the load. And somewhere above, a mason waited at the platform's edge to guide the stone into the space that had been measured for it, long before the block had left the quarry. Alongside the treadwheel stood simpler cranes, timber arms pivoting on a fixed post, worked by ropes and counterweights, useful for shorter lifts and for swinging a block sideways once it had cleared the ground. These were built and rebuilt as the walls climbed, dismantled at one height and reassembled at another, following the work upward the way a tide follows the moon, always present, always adjusting, never quite fixed in place for long. The tools in the mason's hands were, by contrast, almost unchanged from what earlier generations had used, and would remain almost unchanged for generations after. The chisel and mallet for the shaping of stone, the trowel for the spreading of mortar, the square for the truing of corners, and above all the plumb line, a simple weighted cord that told a mason, without ambiguity, whether the wall rising from his hands stood truly vertical or had begun, in some small and dangerous way, to lean. There were no instruments in the sense that a modern builder would recognize them. There was the eye, trained over years of apprenticeship, to notice a deviation of a finger's width across the length of a wall. There was the hand, trained to feel when a stone sat true against its neighbor and when it did not. There was the string, stretched taut between 2 points to establish a line that could be trusted absolutely, so long as the men who set it understood their craft. The tolerances required of this work were not written down in numbers, the way a modern specification might record them. And yet they were understood, passed from master to apprentice, as a kind of inherited certainty. And the walls that resulted from this understanding have stood, in most places, true to the plumb line for the better part of 8 centuries. A fact that speaks for itself more plainly than any figure could. The choir rose first, as it typically did in the building of a great church, because the choir held the high altar, and the altar was, in the reckoning of the age, the reason the entire vast undertaking existed at all. The clergy needed a place to perform the liturgy, long before the rest of the building would be ready to receive a congregation. And so the eastern end of the cathedral was raised, closed, and in some functional sense completed, while the nave to its west remained a construction site, walls rising in fits alongside the ordinary business of worship, continuing just beyond a temporary partition. This was not an unusual arrangement. It was, in fact, the normal condition of a cathedral under construction, and the people of Paris who came to pray in those early decades did so within a building that was, quite literally, still being built around them. The sound of chisels and the calls of masons mixing with the chanting of clergy, in a way that would strike a modern visitor as strange, but that the city of that century accepted as simply the sound its cathedral made while it grew. Years passed, and then decades, and the choir that had once stood as the whole of the completed structure was joined, slowly by the nave extending westward from it, bay by bay, each bay a repetition of the one before it, but never a mere copy. For the masters overseeing the work continued to refine their methods as the building rose, incorporating what they had learned from the settling of the choir's walls, from the behavior of its vaults under load, from the small corrections that every great structure demands of the men who raise it. The nave took its own span of years to complete, and by the time its final bays neared the west end of the site, some of the masters who had begun the work were dead, their names, where they survived at all, preserved only in the sparse fragments of chapter records or in the quiet testimony of the stone itself, cut in a style that a later scholar might recognize as belonging to one hand's particular training. Their successors carried the work forward without pause. For a cathedral, once begun, was not permitted the luxury of waiting for its builders to live long enough to see it whole. It was understood, from the very laying of the foundation stone, that this would be a work outliving its makers, an inheritance passed from one generation of masons to the next, the way a father might pass a trade to a son, except that here the trade passed not through blood alone, but through the guild, through apprenticeship, through the accumulated memory of a workshop that persisted at the site for longer than any single lifetime. The west facade, with its paired towers and its great rose window, came last, rising through the final and slowest stretch of the whole endeavor. For it was here that the ambition of the design met its most public expression, the face that the cathedral would show to the city and to every traveler approaching along the river or across the bridges. The facade demanded a different kind of patience than the choir or the nave had required, for it was not simply a wall to be raised, but a composition to be balanced. Its three great doorways, its ranks of sculpted figures, its rose window, and its twin towers all needing to answer one another in proportion, so that the whole would read, from a distance, as a single unified statement rather than as an accumulation of separate parts. The masters responsible for this stage worked with the same tools their predecessors had used at the choir generations earlier. The same plumb lines and string measures, the same trust in eye and hand. But they worked now with the added burden of coordinating an assembly whose scale exceeded almost anything attempted before it in the region, and whose failure, should the towers lean or the windows' tracery crack under its own weight, would be visible to the entire city. It was during this long middle stretch of construction that the builders confronted a problem that the original design had not fully anticipated. The tall, clerestory windows that admitted light into the nave, one of the great innovations the cathedral's masters had pursued from its earliest planning, placed enormous outward pressure on the upper walls, a pressure that the walls alone, however thick, could not always resist without help. In some sections, hairline cracks began to appear, the stone registering, in its own quiet language, the strain it was being asked to bear. The response of the masters was not to abandon the design or to tear down what had been raised. It was to correct, calmly and methodically, the way a physician might treat a patient's symptom without needing to understand every mechanism behind it. Flying buttresses, angled arms of stone reaching from freestanding piers to the upper walls, were introduced and extended along the length of the building, carrying the outward thrust of the vaults down and away from the walls themselves and into the solid ground below. This was not a single dramatic invention arriving all at once, but a gradual accretion of solutions, added where the walls showed their need and refined as the masters observed how each addition performed under the load of wind and vault alike. The result, over time, was a building that had, in effect, taught its own builders how to finish it, the stone itself communicating, through the language of cracks and settling, what adjustments the design required, and the masters listening and answering and moving on to the next span. Through all of this slow accumulation, the men who governed the cathedral's fortunes from outside its walls changed with a regularity that the building itself seemed almost to ignore. Bishops who had laid early stones were succeeded by bishops who had never known the site as anything but a half-finished cathedral, and those in turn gave way to others who inherited a nave nearing completion and a facade still rising. Kings passed through Paris and through the wider chronicle of the kingdom's fortunes, their reigns measured in years that the cathedral's construction absorbed without visible effect. One monarch's coronation or crisis or war passing by the scaffolding. Much as the seasons passed, noted perhaps in the chapter's records, but scarcely slowing the mason's mallet. It is worth pausing on this simple fact, because it carries a weight that no single dramatic event in the building's history quite matches. No bishop who laid an early stone, and very likely no king who first saw the choir rise, lived to see the towers of the west facade completed. The men who began the work did so in the certain knowledge that they were building for a future they would not inhabit, a discipline of patience that the modern eye, accustomed to projects measured in months, finds difficult to fully comprehend. It was simply the way such things were built in that age, and no one at the time seems to have regarded it as remarkable. And then, at some point that no single document records with the precision a later age might wish for, the towers of the west facade cleared the rooftops of the surrounding city, and Paris, for the first time, could see its cathedral from places where it had never been visible before. A boatman on the river, poling a barge past the bend near the Ile de la Cité, might have looked up on an ordinary morning and found, above the huddled roofs and the smoke of 10,000 hearths, two square towers standing pale against the sky where none had stood before, unfinished still in some of their detail, but unmistakably present, unmistakably permanent, a shape the city had waited nearly 2 centuries to see complete itself against the horizon. But the towers, however, they might dominate a boatman's glance from the river, were only the visible remainder of a labour that had never, in truth, been about towers at all. Beneath the pale stone that now stood against the sky was a longer and quieter history, one written not in the silhouette of the building, but in the daily motion of hands that the silhouette could never show. For every mason whose name might survive in a guild roll or a chapter's account book, there were dozens whose presence in the work is known only by inference, by the sheer volume of stone moved, the sheer number of days a project of this size must have required, the arithmetic of labour that historians perform when the record itself falls silent. The cathedral rose because a great many people, most of them unrecorded, gave the greater part of their working lives to it. One course of stone at a time, one panel of glass at a time, across a stretch of years that outlasted any single labourer's span of strength. The masons who cut and set that stone worked within a structure of trades that had, by the middle of the 12th century, become fairly well defined across northern France, even if the word guild, in its later, more formal sense, had not yet fully hardened into the institutions it would become. There were master masons who might travel between projects and carried with them a portable authority based on demonstrated skill. There were journeymen, paid by the day, who had completed their training, but not yet risen to independent standing. And there were apprentices, often quite young, bound for years to a master who fed and housed them in exchange for labour and the slow transmission of technique. The apprentice learned not from diagrams, for very few survive from this period, and it is unclear how many ever existed in a form apprentices themselves would have consulted, but from watching, from repetition, from the correction of a master's hand guiding a chisel along a line scored in the stone. It was an education measured in years rather than lessons, and a mason who began as a boy sweeping stone dust might not be trusted with the cutting of a capital's foliage until he had spent a decade or more proving his eye and his patience. Wages for this labour are recorded, where they are recorded at all, in scattered account entries that give modern historians only fragments of a much larger ledger now lost. A master mason's pay exceeded that of an unskilled labourer by a significant margin, reflecting both his scarcer skill and the authority he carried on site, while a labourer who did nothing more specialised than haul stone from cart to hoist earned a wage that, by the standards of the age, kept him housed and fed, but rarely comfortable. Carpenters, whose work would eventually rise into the great timber structure above the vaults, the forest of oak beams that later generations would come to call, with a kind of affection, the forest, were paid according to a similar hierarchy of master, journeyman, and apprentice. Though timber work carried its own dangers distinct from stone, dangers of height, and of the sudden failure of a beam under a burden it was never meant to carry. The working day itself was bound not to any clock, for mechanical clocks in the modern sense did not yet exist in most of France, but to the movement of daylight and the ringing of bells that marked the canonical hours observed by the cathedral chapter, and, by extension, by the site around it. Work began near dawn and continued, with breaks for prayer and for the modest meals that sustained a labourer through a physically demanding day, until the light failed, or until the bells rang for an office that called even the working city, briefly, to a kind of attention. In winter, the days shortened and the stone grew harder to work in cold hands. In summer, they lengthened, and the work went on later into warm evenings when the light held. The rhythm was seasonal as much as daily, a pattern that mirrored the agricultural year surrounding Paris, so that a mason's working life was governed by the same slow turning of seasons that governed the harvest. even as his labor built something meant to outlast every harvest that would ever be gathered beneath its shadow. What survives of the human texture of this labor comes to us in fragments, and the fragments are precious precisely because they are so few. Account books occasionally note purchases of bread and wine for workers on particular days, sometimes tied to a feast day or the completion of some visible stage of the work. When a chapter might mark progress with a small measure of generosity toward the men whose labor had achieved it. There are references, scattered across cathedral building records of the period more broadly, to injuries suffered on site, a fall from scaffolding, a hand crushed beneath a block of stone being lowered by rope and pulley, a death recorded briefly and without elaboration, the kind of entry that modern readers might wish said more, but which the clerk who wrote it evidently felt required no further comment. Such records are not unique to Notre-Dame. They appear across the surviving documentation of Gothic construction generally, and historians draw on this broader body of evidence to understand what conditions at Notre-Dame itself, less fully documented in this respect, likely resembled. Prayers before dangerous work are attested more by inference than by direct record. The presence of small chapels and altars near major building sites of the period, the general religious culture in which nearly every laborer of the age was formed, suggests that a man climbing scaffolding to set a stone 40 feet above the transept floor would have crossed himself, or murmured some private appeal, before trusting his weight to the ropes and the judgment of whoever had built the platform beneath him. Whether this happened at Notre-Dame specifically, in this particular form, no surviving document confirms. But the absence of a specific record is not evidence of absence in practice, only evidence of what the age thought worth writing down, and the age, as a rule, did not think a mason's private prayer worth the ink. Among the trades that gathered to Notre-Dame's slow rise, the glassmakers held a place apart, for their craft combined manual skill with a kind of chemistry that bordered, in the eyes of some contemporaries, on the arcane. The making of colored glass in this period required the fusing of sand with alkaline materials at high heat, and the introduction of specific mineral compounds to achieve specific colors: cobalt for certain blues, copper for reds and greens, manganese for purples, in ratios and firing conditions that were not written down in any surviving technical manual from this exact period, but were passed from master glazier to apprentice by direct instruction and long practice. The same oral inheritance that governed the mason's trade but applied to a material far less forgiving of error. Glass that emerged from the kiln too thick or too thin, or fired at the wrong temperature, could crack under the stress of its own leading, or fail to hold its color evenly, and a glazier's reputation rested on his ability to produce, panel after panel, a consistency that modern chemists studying surviving medieval glass have found remarkable given the absence of any instrument capable of measuring the temperatures involved. The great rose windows of Notre-Dame and the many lancet windows that would eventually fill the cathedral's walls with colored light depended on this inherited, largely unwritten knowledge, refined across generations of workshops whose names are, for the most part, as lost to record as the masons who cut the stone around their work. What survives is the glass itself and the physical evidence embedded within it. The precise composition of ancient panels, analyzed in the modern period by scientists using techniques the medieval glazier could not have imagined, offers a kind of testimony the written record never provided, a chemical signature standing in for the biography no document preserved. This absence of names, running so consistently through every trade that built the cathedral, deserves to be met with something more than simple regret. It reflects, in part, a genuine feature of how medieval labor was recorded and remembered. The individual worker mattered in the documentary habits of the age, chiefly insofar as he was paid, and payment records name amounts more often than they name people. And when they do name people, it is usually only the master, whose contract or commission created the paper trail in the first place. The journeyman and the apprentice, the labourer who hauled stone and the boy who mixed mortar, pass through the record as entries in a wage list. If they pass through it at all, their individual identities dissolved into the collective noun of the workers that chroniclers and account keepers alike found sufficient. This is not unique to Notre-Dame, nor even to Gothic cathedrals generally. It is a broader feature of how pre-modern labour across nearly every trade and every country was documented, or rather was not documented, by a written culture that reserved its ink for those whose names carried legal, financial, or spiritual weight. To reckon with this absence, honestly, is not to invent names where none survive, nor to pretend that some deeper record exists waiting to be found, but to hold the silence itself as part of the cathedral's true history. To recognize that the building's stones are, in a very literal sense, a monument to labour the written record chose, whether by habit or by indifference, not to preserve, and that the reverence owed to that labour must be paid without the comfort of knowing whose hands, precisely, are being honoured. And so the work went forward, generation succeeding generation, the master who trained an apprentice in his 30s giving way by the time the vaults above the choir were closing, to that same apprentice now grown old and training apprentices of his own, who would in turn labour on sections of the building their own masters had never lived to see begin. Fathers passed trades to sons within the same workshop lineages that historians can trace, where records permit, across 2 or even 3 generations of a single family's masons or glaziers. The cathedral itself outliving every individual span of skill that contributed to it, absorbing each generation's labour into a whole no single lifetime could have witnessed complete. The sound of chisels on stone, so constant across the site for so many decades that it must have become, to the people living nearest the cathedral close, less a noise than a kind of ambient silence, a background hum indistinguishable from the ordinary sound of the city itself, went on through spring and summer, faded with the shortening light of autumn, and resumed each year when the days lengthened again, until at last, after generations whose names the record kept only in fragments, the final vault above the nave was closed, the last stone set into place by hands whose owner history does not record, and the sound that had accompanied the cathedral's whole slow rising, finally quietly, after nearly 2 centuries, fell still. The masons who had set that final stone did not linger to mark the occasion, for there was no single occasion to mark. A vault, unlike a doorway or a gate, does not announce its own completion. It simply stops needing more stone. The ribs that had climbed from opposite piers for months, each one cut to a curve calculated long before by men who had likely died before seeing it proven, met at last somewhere above the nave floor, in a small stone boss, carved sometimes with a flower, sometimes with a face, sometimes with nothing more than a plain disc to mark the point where 4 lines of force resolved into one. The scaffolding beneath it, the wooden centering that had held the ribs in their false position while the mortar cured, was struck away in stages, a process the masons approached with the same unhurried caution they had shown at every earlier stage of the work. It was not lowered all at once. Wedges were eased, one at a time, across the width of the bay, so that the stone might settle by fractions rather than all at once, testing its own new weight in increments too small to notice from the floor below. This was, in its quiet way, the first true trial the vault faced. Not wind, not bells, not the press of a crowd, but simply itself, the plain fact of its own mass, asked to stand without the wooden frame that had carried it through every year of its making. The masons who eased those wedges free left no account of what they felt in that hour, if they felt anything beyond the ordinary tension of careful work. But the stone held. It settled as all vaulted stone settles by some small and permitted measure. The joints tightening, the mortar taking its final set, and the ribs found the shape they would keep, with only minor variants for centuries afterward. It is worth pausing on what that vault was actually required to do, because the drama of its closing is easy to overstate and easy, in the opposite direction, to miss entirely. A stone ceiling raised some 30 meters above a cathedral floor is not, in the end, resisting some singular dramatic force. It is resisting the plain, patient pull of the earth on every stone within it, redirected outward and downward through ribs and piers, and, beyond the walls, through the flying buttresses that had been added and refined as the building rose, until that pull reached the ground and was answered there. The vault's first true test was simply gravity, applied continuously, without pause, for the rest of its existence. Wind came next, though wind on a stone structure of this mass behaves differently than it does on a wooden one, pressing rather than shaking, testing the mortar joints and the buttress lines rather than the timber frame. And bells, when they came, tested something else again. Not the vault directly, since the bells hung in the towers rather than above the nave, but the whole cathedral's tolerance for vibration, for the long, low shudder that travels through a masonry structure each time several tons of bronze are set swinging by hand. None of these tests arrived as spectacle. They arrived as they always do in the life of a great structure, gradually, repeatedly, so gradually that no single day could be pointed to as the day the building proved itself. It simply continued to stand, season after season, through winds that toppled lesser roofs and through the ringing of bells that had not existed when the first foundation stones were laid. And in that continuation lay whatever proof the builders would ever receive. The cathedral that stood by the time the high vault closed was not, however, the cathedral its first designers had drawn. It rarely is. The record of a great building's construction is, more often than the popular telling admits, a record of correction, of plans altered by the men who came after the men who made them, of features added because taste had shifted or because a bishop's ambitions had grown, of features abandoned because money or stone or years had run short. Notre-Dame's western towers offer perhaps the clearest example. The lower stages of the facade, with their great portals and their rose window, had been substantially set in place earlier in the building's life, following, in broad terms, the intentions laid down at the start. But the towers themselves, the two great square masses that would come to define the cathedral's silhouette against the Paris sky, were not finished until decades later, raised by masons working from a vision that had been revised more than once in the interval. The original plan, so far as later scholars have been able to reconstruct it from the surviving evidence, may have called for spires atop each tower, slender points rising above the square masonry, echoing a form common to other great churches of the period. If such spires were ever intended, they were never built. The towers were left with flat tops, a decision whose exact reasoning the sources do not preserve, though it has been suggested that cost, or a shift in preference toward the planar profile, or simply the practical difficulties of raising still more masonry to still greater heights, may have played a part. What survives and what generations since have come to regard as the cathedral's defining face is therefore not quite what the first designers imagined. It is what compromise, cost, and time allowed. The same pattern holds for the cathedral's most famous vertical feature, the tall spire that for many people today is inseparable from the very idea of Notre-Dame, and which is, in fact, not original to the building at all in the form most recently known. A spire had risen above the crossing, where nave and transept meet, at some point after the main structure was substantially complete. A slender wooden frame sheathed in lead, rising well above the roofline, visible across the rooftops of the city. This first spire stood for centuries, weathering storms and the slow decay common to any exposed wooden structure, until age, and likely structural concern, led to its removal in the latter part of the 18th century. For a time afterward, the crossing stood without one, the roofline interrupted, the silhouette changed from what generations of Parisians had known. It was not until the 19th century, during a broader campaign of restoration undertaken after the cathedral had passed through years of neglect and, at points, deliberate damage during periods of civil unrest, that a new spire was designed and raised in its place. This later spire, taller and more elaborate than accounts suggest the first had been, was the work of an architect steeped in the study of the building's own medieval forms, who sought less to invent something new than to recover, in his own reading of the evidence, what such a structure might once have looked like, filtered inevitably through the taste and technical means of his own century. The spire he raised, ringed with figures cast in copper and crowned with a weathercock, stood for well over a century after its completion, itself becoming in time as fixed a part of the cathedral's identity as anything drawn on the earliest plans. Though it was, in the strictest sense, no older than many ordinary buildings still standing in the city around it. This is the pattern by which cathedrals such as this one actually take their final form, and it is worth resisting the temptation to smooth it into a single continuous act of vision realized. Notre-Dame, by the time it could reasonably be called complete, was already a compound object, parts raised by the earliest masons working from plans now lost, parts revised by later builders, responding to changed taste or changed need, parts added centuries afterward, by restorers who were, in their own way, imagining a medieval past as much as recovering it. The bishop who first called for the cathedral's construction, and the masters who drew its earliest plans, could not have foreseen the spire that would one day stand above the crossing, nor the particular flat-topped towers that would come to define its western face, nor the long silence that would fall over its interior during periods when the building was stripped of much of its statuary and put to other uses entirely. What they set in motion was not a fixed design executed faithfully across 2 centuries, but a slow, cumulative negotiation between an original ambition and everything that time, money, taste, and circumstance would later demand of it. This is not, in itself, a diminishment. Few buildings of true scale escape it. The record simply asks that the story be told honestly rather than smoothed, and the honest version is one in which the cathedral's final form was arrived at gradually, through compromise as much as through vision, and was still being adjusted, refined, and in places rebuilt, long after anyone connected to its founding had passed from memory. When, at last, the towers stood finished, their bells hung and readied, and the nave lay covered by the vault that had closed above it. After so many years of quiet, patient masonry, the cathedral rang in a way it never fully had before. Bells had likely sounded over the site at earlier stages, marking hours or calling workers from their labor, hung temporarily in whatever structure could bear their weight. But now the towers built to carry them properly stood complete, and the vault built to hold the wind above the nave stood closed. And the west front, however different from its earliest sketches, stood finished in the form the city would come to know for the whole of the building's history that followed. On the day, or across the days, when the bells were rung together, fully hung in their finished towers, over a nave finally roofed in stone rather than temporary timber, the sound that reached across the rooftops of the city was, in a real sense, one Paris had never heard before. Not bells over a construction site, not bells over a partial structure still climbing toward its own completion, but bells over a cathedral that had, after generations of labor whose beginning few living then could remember firsthand, finally become the whole thing its first stones had promised. It rang out over a city that had grown up around the project as thoroughly as the project had grown up within the city, over streets and bridges and a river that had watched the work rise stone by stone for longer than most lives lasted, and it did not announce itself as history. It simply sounded ordinary and enormous at once, over rooftops that had, by then, known no other skyline within living memory. What a visitor found, standing at last beneath that finished skyline, was not a single impression, but a slow accumulation of them, offered level by level, as if the building itself understood that no eye could take in the whole of it at once, and had been designed, patiently, to be read the way its builders had raised it, from the ground upward and from the outside in. The west front received the eye first, as it had always been meant to, its two towers standing not quite identical to one another, a small and telling honesty in a building otherwise so careful about symmetry, evidence that the men who finished the second tower were not the men who had begun the first, and had not troubled themselves to erase the difference. Below the towers, 3 deep portals opened into the dark, each one carved with tiers of figures that rose in bands toward the pointed arches above them, kings and prophets, and the long compressed narrative of judgment and mercy that medieval sculpture told to a population that could not read but could look, and did, for as long as they stood there. And above the portals, holding the center of that western wall the way a single eye holds a face, the great rose window opened its circle of stone tracery and colored glass, a wheel of light that caught the low western sun in the late afternoons and threw a version of itself, faint and shifting, onto the pavement of the square below. To walk around the building's flanks was to meet a different kind of portrait, less a face than a skeleton laid bare for study. The flying buttresses that had solved, generations earlier, the problem of a nave grown too tall and too thin-walled to stand on its own, had by the time of the cathedral's completion multiplied into something closer to a small forest, arching outward from the upper walls in ranks, carrying the outward thrust of the vaults, down and away to piers set along the ground like roots. Seen from a distance, along the river, or from one of the bridges that had watched the work for so long, they gave the building a silhouette unlike any that had stood in the city before it, a structure that seemed, from certain angles, to be less built than grown, its stone ribs spreading the way a tree spreads its branches to catch what light and weight it must carry. Engineers who studied the building long after its builders were forgotten by name would come to understand what those buttresses accomplished with a clarity the original masons likely felt in their hands and their eyes before they ever had the mathematics to prove it, that a wall built thin and tall, pierced by glass rather than closed in stone, could still stand, could still carry a vaulted roof of considerable weight, provided that weight was guided outward and downward along a path as deliberate as any load-bearing wall, only invisible, translated into the elegant curve of an arch reaching from the clerestory to a buttress standing apart from the building's main body, like a companion rather than a limb. Inside, the impression changed again, and changed completely. Where the exterior offered mass and structure laid open to the sky, the interior offered height and hush and a particular quality of light that no single window, however large, could have produced on its own. The nave rose in ribbed vaults far overhead, each bay a repeated unit of stone ribs meeting at a keystone, the pattern marching away toward the choir in a rhythm that drew the eye forward, the way a colonnade draws the eye down a long room. Except that here, the room did not stay level. It climbed. It opened, until a visitor entering from the western doors found themselves suddenly small, in a way that streets and houses, however grand, did not usually make a person feel small. The scale was not accidental. and it was not merely a display of what stone could be made to do. It was, according to what can be understood of the intentions recorded and implied by the men who built such places across that century, meant to produce exactly that sensation, to remove a person for a few minutes from the ordinary proportions of daily life and set them instead inside a space built to the proportions of something else entirely, something the builders believed deserved height and light beyond what any house or hall required. The light itself came filtered through glass that had been assembled, panel by panel, over decades, in colors that no later technique would fully reproduce. Reds and blues achieved through methods of glass making, since only partly recovered by historians and craftsmen who have studied the surviving windows with the particular patience of people trying to recreate a lost recipe. On a clear day, that light did not fall into the nave so much as it colored the air itself, tinting the pale stone of the piers and the floor beneath the clerestory windows with a wash of red or blue that shifted slowly as the sun moved outside, so that the same spot on the same afternoon could look entirely different an hour later, without anyone having touched a single pane. Visitors recorded across the centuries that followed a certain instinctive lowering of the voice upon entering, an unspoken agreement that the space asked for quiet, whether or not a service was underway, and that agreement held remarkably steady across generations of visitors who had nothing else in common. Pilgrims and monarchs and merchants and, eventually, tourists with no particular faith at all, each finding themselves speaking more softly than they had outside, as if the building itself had trained them to it before they had time to decide. It was later, well after the great vaults had closed and the towers had risen to their final height, that another kind of figure joined the building's silhouette, one less concerned with narrative or symbol in the way of the portal sculptures, and more concerned, at least in its origin, with a practical problem that every roofed stone building of that scale eventually faces. What to do with rainwater gathered across acres of lead and stone, and how to send it away from the walls before it could work its way into joints and mortar, and begin, slowly, the patient erosion that water performs on any structure given enough centuries to work in. The solution, adopted and refined across cathedrals of the period, was the gargoyle, a carved stone spout designed to catch that water at the roofline and throw it outward, clear of the walls below, in a long arc that, during a hard rain, could be seen from the square as a series of thin, silver ropes falling from the building's upper edges. But the masons and sculptors given the task of carving those spouts did not content themselves with plain channels, and instead gave nearly every one of them a face, and not always a kindly one. Beasts with open mouths through which the water poured. Birds, hybrid creatures with the bodies of one animal and the heads of another. Watchful and strange, perched along the roofline in ranks that a visitor standing far below could barely make out as individual figures at all, only as a general impression of something alert looking down. Alongside them, though somewhat later and less directly tied to any drainage function, came the chimeras, decorative grotesques set along balustrades and towers with no water to carry, existing seemingly for their own sake or for whatever half-remembered symbolic purpose their carvers intended, watching over the city from a height that put them closer to the birds than to the people whose reign they had, in the case of their functional cousins, spent centuries quietly redirecting. Their exact original meaning, whether purely practical dressed up as ornament, or ornament dressed up as warning, or something closer to a private joke among the masons who carved them where no patron was likely to climb up and object, remains a matter the sources do not settle cleanly, and later restorers, working from what fragments and records survived, would eventually be left to imagine some of those faces anew, working in the spirit of the originals rather than from any surviving instruction as to what, precisely, the medieval carvers had meant by them. Beneath those watchful stone faces, The building settled into the long rhythm of the life it had been built to hold. And that life turned out to be considerably larger than the daily business of a single parish. It became, within a generation of its completion, the customary setting for occasions the city itself considered too important for any smaller church. Royal weddings conducted beneath its vaults, with a scale of ceremony that filled the nave from the western doors to the choir screen. Coronations and state occasions that drew crowds into the square outside long before the doors opened. Funeral rites for monarchs and for lesser figures whose families could afford the honour of a service within those walls, rather than in a parish chapel elsewhere in the city. Processions moved through its doors on the great feast days of the church calendar, clergy and choir, and often much of the surrounding neighbourhood following behind, out into streets hung with cloth for the occasion, and back in again, the building serving for those hours as a kind of hinge between the sacred calendar and the ordinary calendar of a city that otherwise measured its days by markets and bells and the changing of the seasons along the river. And beneath all of that occasional grandeur, day upon ordinary day, ran the quieter business the building had first been raised to hold. The daily mass, said in a side chapel or before a modest gathering on an unremarkable Tuesday. The confession heard in a side aisle, the candle lit by someone whose name no record kept. The small private transaction between one person and their faith, that the whole enormous structure existed, in the end, chiefly to shelter and to dignify, whether or not a single soul beyond that one person ever knew it had happened. What later study of the building would increasingly emphasize, once the tools of structural engineering had developed the vocabulary to describe it precisely, was how finely balanced the whole achievement had been between two qualities that do not naturally sit together in stone: mass and lightness, weight enough to hold a roof safely aloft for centuries, and openness enough to fill that same roofed space with glass and air rather than solid wall. Every element of the building, examined separately, seemed to lean toward one of those two qualities at the expense of the other. The great piers built heavy and solid to carry compression straight down into the earth. The clerestory walls built thin and glazed to let in light with almost no mass at all. The flying buttresses standing apart from the walls they served, neither fully part of the enclosed space nor separate from the structure's real work of holding it upright. And yet the building as a whole did not read as a compromise between those extremes, or as a structure straining visibly against its own contradictions, but as something that had resolved them so thoroughly that centuries of visitors could stand inside it and feel only the lightness, the height, the color of the glass, without ever consciously registering the enormous quiet labor of compression and thrust being carried invisibly down through buttress and pier to the foundations laid so carefully in the ground so long before. It is that resolved quality, more than any single measurement of height or span, that later engineers would return to study most closely, treating the cathedral less as a monument to be admired and more as a structural argument that had, somehow, in an age before their mathematics existed to prove it, gotten the argument right. And so it stood, at last, in the calm that follows any long labour once the labour is finished. Towers finished, vaults closed, glass set, gargoyles watching over rain that no longer troubled the walls beneath them. Its work, for the moment, briefly and completely done, above a river that had carried its stone, and above a city that had, without quite noticing the exact day it happened, grown a skyline it would not otherwise recognize itself without. A finished cathedral is not a cathedral at rest. It is a cathedral that has only now begun to be used the way it was intended. And the centuries that followed the closing of its vaults were not centuries of stillness, but of passage, coronations and funerals, processions and disputes, the ordinary devotions of a city that had grown up around a building it could no longer imagine itself without. Kings were married beneath its rose windows. Kings were mourned beneath them too. The cathedral took in the ordinary Sunday crowds, and the extraordinary state occasions with the same patient stone, its doors opening and closing on centuries the way a single day opens and closes on hours, each one distinct to those who lived it, and each one, from the vantage of the building itself, simply more time passing through. For much of that span, the cathedral's life was the life of the monarchy it stood beside, the two so bound together in ceremony that it became difficult, after a while, to say which one lent the other its authority. Henry VI of England was crowned King of France within it during the 100 Years' War, a coronation that testified less to Notre-Dame's neutrality than to how thoroughly a cathedral's blessing could be claimed by whoever held the city at the time. Napoleon Bonaparte would later be crowned emperor within the same walls, in a ceremony that borrowed the cathedral's centuries of accumulated solemnity for a regime only a few years old, the building's age lending legitimacy to a power that had none of its own to spare. This was, in some sense, the quiet function a cathedral performs across a long life. It does not choose the powers that use it, only lends them, for an afternoon, the weight of everything that came before. But the centuries were not kind in any steady, gradual way, and the building's history is not a smooth ascent from consecration to veneration. It runs instead through a period in which the cathedral was very nearly lost, not to fire, not yet, but to the deliberate hands of people who saw in its stone not sanctity, but the symbols of everything they had risen up to overthrow. The French Revolution arrived at Notre-Dame's doors in the 1790s, with a fury that was, in its way, as considered and purposeful as the masons who had raised the building in the first place, only aimed at undoing rather than building. The revolutionary government declared the cathedral a temple of reason, stripping it of its Catholic function and repurposing it for the new civic religion the revolution hoped to install in place of the old. Statues were pulled down from the west front, not randomly but specifically, because the crowds and the officials directing them believed the 28 kings ranged above the portals were statues of the kings of France, an unbroken lineage of monarchy carved into the building's very face. They were wrong. The figures were kings of Judah and Israel, biblical ancestors of Christ rather than French monarchs at all, a distinction that mattered enormously to art historians centuries later, and mattered not at all to the revolutionaries with ropes and hammers in 1793, who saw crowned stone heads and understood them, correctly enough in spirit if not in fact, as symbols of an authority they had come to destroy. The heads were struck from the bodies. Many were lost outright, broken into rubble or carted away, and it would be nearly 2 centuries before a cache of them was rediscovered by chance beneath a building near the cathedral, buried where someone, no record says who, had apparently hidden them rather than let them be ground to lime. The interior fared little better in those years. Treasures accumulated across 5 centuries, reliquaries, precious metalwork, the accumulated devotional wealth of generations of donors, were seized and melted down to fund the revolution's wars. The same fires that had once forged crowns for kings, now consuming the very objects that had celebrated them. The cathedral's great bells, save for the deepest of them, were removed and melted for cannon, the building's voice silenced along with its face. For a period, the building was used as a warehouse, its nave stacked with barrels of stored provisions, the site of coronations and centuries of solemn liturgy, reduced to something closer to municipal storage. Later still, it briefly served the cult of the Supreme Being, another of the revolution's short-lived attempts to fashion a new sacred order out of the wreckage of the old. Before that too passed, and the building's status remained, for years afterward, genuinely uncertain. Napoleon's coronation in 1804 marked a return of official ceremony to the cathedral. But ceremony is not the same as care, and the building that hosted an emperor's crowning was, by any honest accounting, in a state of real decay. Decades of neglect, revolutionary damage, and simple weathering had left the stonework crumbling in places, statuary missing or defaced, and the structure generally regarded, by the standards of the age at least, as an aging relic rather than a national treasure worth serious investment. Paris of the early 1800s had other priorities. The cathedral that had once represented the summit of what a city could build now stood, in the eyes of many of the city's own residents, as something closer to an obstacle, a crumbling medieval leftover in a neighborhood many wished to modernize, its darkened stone matching too well the general sense that it belonged to a past the present had outgrown. What changed this, more than any single act of government or church, was a novel. Victor Hugo published Notre-Dame de Paris in 1831, and whatever his literary ambitions may have been, the book's effect on the cathedral's fortunes was immediate and, in retrospect, difficult to overstate. Hugo wrote the building as a character in its own right, ancient, wounded, magnificent, and slowly being lost to indifference. And he used his narrative, quite deliberately, to argue for the preservation of Gothic architecture at a moment when it was fashionable in some circles to regard the style as barbarous and unrefined next to classical form. He described, with evident anguish, the many small mutilations the centuries had inflicted on the building. Statues removed, windows replaced with clear glass that let in cold modern light where colored glass had once held. Something closer to reverence, additions and subtractions made by architects and clergy across the years with little regard for what the original builders had intended. The novel's popularity turned this architectural argument into something like a popular cause. Readers who had walked past Notre-Dame for years without much thought began to see it, through Hugo's telling, as something worth saving, and public sentiment, once stirred, proved strong enough to reach the government. By the 1840s, that sentiment had translated into an official restoration commission, and the man chosen to lead it was a young architect named Viollet-le-Duc, working alongside Jean-Baptiste Lassus in the project's earliest years. What followed was one of the most consequential restorations in the history of European architecture, and also one of the most debated, because Viollet-le-Duc did not confine himself to repairing what had existed and had since decayed. He restored, certainly, resetting stonework, repairing tracery, returning statuary to niches that had stood empty since the Revolution. But he also added, and it is in those additions that his legacy becomes complicated. The cathedral's medieval spire, removed decades earlier due to structural instability and storm damage, had been gone for the better part of a century by the time Viollet-le-Duc took up the project. He designed a new one, taller, more elaborate, ringed at its base with copper statues of the 12 apostles, one of them bearing his own face among the group, a signature quietly inserted into the very structure he was tasked with restoring. He also introduced the chimeras that would become, in time, nearly as famous as the cathedral's older gargoyles. Grotesque, watchful figures perched along the towers and galleries, staring out over the rooftops of Paris in poses that struck later generations as quintessentially medieval. Despite having been carved in the 1850s, products of Viollet-le-Duc's own imagination and his particular theory of what Gothic ornament ought to look like, rather than direct copies of anything the original builders had made. This is the tension that has followed his name ever since. Viollet-le-Duc did not simply return Notre-Dame to some prior state. No such single, stable prior state truly existed to return to, given how many alterations the building had already accumulated across 7 centuries of continuous use. What he did, instead, was interpret the cathedral, reading its surviving fragments and its documented history, and filling the gaps with additions he believed were faithful to its spirit, even where they were, by any strict standard, his own invention. Later, architectural historians would praise the sensitivity of much of his structural work, while questioning, sometimes sharply, whether a restoration architect ought to leave quite so much of himself inside the object he was hired to preserve. The debate has never fully settled, and in a sense it did not need to. The spire and the chimeras became, over the following century and a half, simply Notre-Dame's spire and Notre-Dame's chimeras, inseparable in the public imagination from the medieval fabric around them, regardless of the exact decade in which they were carved. After Viollet-le-Duc's death in 1879, the great dramatic phase of the cathedral's modern life gave way to something quieter and much less remembered. Decades of ordinary maintenance, the kind of unglamorous recurring labor that never produces a single named architect or a fixed date worth celebrating, but without which no medieval structure survives at all. Soot from the coal fires of an industrializing Paris settled steadily into the pale limestone, darkening the west front over the course of generations until the building's famous grey-black coloring, so often assumed to be its natural or original hue, was in fact largely the accumulated residue of a century of urban air. Stonework was cleaned, then dirtied again, then cleaned once more. Roof leads were patched. Individual carvings, worn past recognition by rain and wind, were quietly replaced by masons whose names went unrecorded in any newspaper, continuing a tradition of anonymous labor that stretched back, in an unbroken, if largely undocumented line, to the first builders who had never signed their own work either. Through all of this, and through 2 world wars that reduced much of the surrounding continent to rubble and reshaped the political map beyond recognition, Notre-Dame itself remained, remarkably, largely untouched by direct violence. Paris was occupied and later liberated. Artillery and bombing fell on countless European cities, cathedrals among them, some destroyed outright, others gutted and rebuilt from little more than their foundations. Notre-Dame endured both wars with its structure essentially intact, a fixed point above a city that changed around it in ways no medieval mason could have anticipated. Occupied streets, liberated streets, a skyline that grew taller and more modern with each passing decade, while the cathedral's twin towers held their same relative height above the rooftops, patient in a way that made the passing century feel briefer than it was. It had survived revolution, decay, well-meaning reinvention, and the ordinary slow abrasion of 800 years. And it stood at the middle of the 20th century, much as it had stood at the height of the 19th. Darkened, weathered, endlessly restored, and endlessly requiring restoration again. But standing, its stone still carrying the argument its builders had made so long before anyone thought to question whether it would still be believed centuries later. That argument, though, had never belonged to Notre-Dame alone. To understand what the cathedral was saying with its stone, it helps to step back from Paris entirely, to widen the view across the plains and river valleys of northern France and beyond, where in the span of little more than a century, a whole generation of cathedrals rose in conversation with one another, each one answering the last, each one trying to say something slightly bolder about how high stone could climb and how thin a wall could become before it was more window than wall at all. Notre-Dame was not the first of these buildings, and it would not be the last, and it was never, in its own time, considered the final word on the matter. It was one voice among several, raised in the same register, speaking the same new language that masons and bishops across the region had begun to develop out of ambition, faith, and an accumulating body of practical knowledge about what stone could be made to do if it was cut correctly and braced in the right places. To the southwest, at Chartres, a cathedral rose whose windows would become legendary for a blue that no one has ever fully explained, a color that seemed to hold light rather than merely admit it. Chartres shared with Notre-Dame the same grammar of pointed arches and ribbed vaults, but it pushed the walls thinner still, and let more of the interior surface dissolve into glass, so that the nave was bathed in a coloured dusk, even at midday. Where Notre-Dame's western towers stand square and matched, deliberate in their symmetry, Chartres kept one spire plain and stern from the 12th century and let the other rise later, in the early 16th, ornate and reaching, a mismatch that has its own charm, a visible record of centuries of change rather than a single unified vision. The building was not less ambitious for its irregularity. If anything, it wore its long, uneven history more openly than Notre-Dame did, refusing to pretend that its centuries had all agreed with one another. Further east, at Reims, the cathedral that would come to host the coronation of French kings rose with a facade dense with carved figures, tier upon tier of saints and kings and angels, so that the west front reads almost as a sculpted book, meant to be studied rather than simply admired. Reims took the vertical ambition further than Notre-Dame had dared, its interior climbing to a height that made the nave feel narrower and more urgent, drawing the eye upward with less patience than Notre-Dame allowed. And at Amiens, not far away, the builders pushed higher still, raising a nave so tall that for centuries it stood among the highest vaulted interiors ever built in stone, a gamble against gravity that required buttressing on a scale even bolder than what Paris had attempted. Flying supports thrown out from the walls like ribs holding a great lung open against its own weight. Beyond France, the same ambition crossed borders and language, carried by masons who travelled from site to site, from bishop to bishop, from one competitive chapter to the next, bringing with them not blueprints in the modern sense, but a shared vocabulary, a working understanding of proportion, of how a rib should meet a pier, of how a buttress should be stepped to carry a vault's outward thrust down into the earth without the wall beneath it splitting apart. At Cologne, in the German lands, a cathedral was begun in the 13th century, in direct emulation of these French ambitions, its towers designed to rise higher than any that had come before, though the building itself would stand unfinished, its cranes idle for centuries, its western towers no more than partial stumps against the sky, for so long that the incomplete cathedral became, almost by accident, a kind of monument to the very difficulty of the enterprise it represented. It would not be completed until the 19th century, when a rediscovered set of medieval plans allowed builders long removed from the original masons to finish what they had begun, a strange bridge across 600 years of interrupted ambition. This was the company Notre-Dame kept, this network of cathedrals rising and half-rising across a continent, each one a kind of argument in stone about height, about light, about how much of a wall might safely become window, how far a vault might be pushed before it needed to be reinforced from outside, how tall a spire could climb before the tower beneath it needed to be reconsidered entirely. The masons who carried this argument from town to town were rarely named in the surviving records, much like the masters who worked on Notre-Dame itself. But their movement can be traced in the buildings they left behind, in the repeated solutions, the shared proportions, the recurring details that appear in cathedral after cathedral with only minor variation, as though a single conversation had simply continued from one work site to the next, carried in the memory and hands of men who never wrote down what they knew, because it did not occur to them that anyone would need it written. That conversation did not stay within cathedral walls. Once the vocabulary of ribs and pointed arches and buttressed height had proven itself, it began to appear in buildings that had nothing to do with worship at all. University halls built in the centuries that followed borrowed the pointed window and the ribbed ceiling because they signified seriousness, permanence, an institution reaching for something beyond the merely practical. Civic buildings, town halls, guild halls, and later, far from Europe entirely, churches and chapels built by colonial and missionary hands carried echoes of the same silhouette across oceans. A spire here, a rose window there, a nave proportioned by instinct or explicit reference to what Paris or Reims or Chartres had done centuries before. Even into the modern era, longer after the technology of stone vaulting had been rendered largely obsolete by steel and concrete, architects designing churches, libraries, and university buildings continued to reach for the Gothic silhouette when they wanted a structure to feel as though it belonged to something older and more patient than the century it was built in. Notre-Dame's outline, that particular balance of twin towers and a single soaring spire behind them, became so familiar that it was copied in cities the medieval masons could not have located on a map, a shape recognized even by those who had never crossed the Atlantic or the Channel, let alone stood before the building itself. But if this was a shared triumph, it was also everywhere a shared vulnerability. No cathedral in this long contest of height and light escaped without scars, and the scars tended to come from the same handful of sources again and again across every country and century. Fire was the most persistent of these. Chartres itself had burned more than once before the cathedral that stands today was built, each fire followed by a decision to rebuild rather than abandon, each rebuilding an opportunity to push the design a little further than before. Reims suffered catastrophic damage in the 20th century, not from an accident of candle or lightning, but from the shelling of the First World War, its roof destroyed, its stones scarred and blackened. The rebuilding afterward, a long, deliberate act of both engineering and memory, a decision to restore not merely a building, but a symbol that had come to matter to an entire nation. Collapse, too, was a shared danger. At Beauvais, another French cathedral that pushed its vault to what may have been the very edge of what medieval stone could bear. A section of the choir came down in the 13th century, not long after it was completed. A stark reminder that ambition in these buildings was never a purely theoretical risk. The choir was rebuilt with additional reinforcement, but the transept and nave at Beauvais were never finished at all, leaving behind a soaring fragment, extraordinary and incomplete, evidence that even among the most skilled builders of the age, the margin between triumph and failure could be thin enough to disappear entirely. Notre-Dame's own scars, the revolutionary defacement of its statuary, the centuries of grime and structural fatigue that Viollet-le-Duc's restoration had addressed, the persistent question of whether its walls and buttresses could be trusted indefinitely without renewed intervention, were simply its version of a story every one of these buildings told in its own dialect. To have stood for centuries without any damage at all would have been the anomaly. What makes each cathedral distinct is not whether it suffered, but how, and how it was mended afterward, and by whom, and with what understanding of what had originally been intended. It was in the 20th century, well after the age of bishops and traveling masons had passed, that a different kind of attention began to be paid to buildings like Notre-Dame, one that came not from faith or civic pride, but from engineering and archaeology working in tandem. Historians of architecture, many of them trained in the physics of structures rather than merely their aesthetics, began to study cathedrals like Notre-Dame with instruments and methods the medieval builders could never have imagined. Precise surveys of how far the walls had shifted over the centuries, analysis of the stone itself to determine its quarry origin and structural properties, careful photographic documentation of every visible crack and settlement, patient efforts to reconstruct, on paper and later on computer, exactly how the forces within the building moved from vault to rib, to pier, to buttress, to earth. This scholarship did not diminish the achievement of the original builders. If anything, it deepened it, because what these later engineers and historians found, again and again, was that the masters of the 12th and 13th centuries had understood their materials with a precision that modern analysis could only confirm rather than correct. The proportions that had seemed, from a distance, like matters of taste or tradition, revealed themselves under close study to be functional solutions, worked out through experience and inherited practice long before anyone had the mathematics to describe them formally. Notre-Dame's own flying buttresses, once suspected by some early scholars to be later additions rather than integral to the original design, were shown through careful study of the stone and mortar to have been part of the building's evolving structural logic almost from its earliest completed stages. Evidence that the masters had recognized and responded to the outward thrust of their high vaults even as the building rose. This modern attention meant that by the time the 20th century reached its middle decades, Notre-Dame was no longer only a place of worship and a monument for tourists and Parisians alike, but also a subject of ongoing scientific curiosity, a structure whose every stone might eventually be measured, mapped, and understood. In terms its original builders would not have used, but might well have recognized in principle. It was watched, in other words, in a way it had never quite been watched before. Its slow settlements and minor shifts tracked with an attentiveness that came from knowing, now, just how singular and how fragile the achievement of the whole cathedral chain, from Chartres to Reims to Amiens to Cologne to Paris, truly had been. And so Notre-Dame's endurance, remarkable as it was on its own terms, is best understood as one contribution to a far longer human conversation. A centuries-long argument carried out in stone and glass across an entire continent, about how high a wall might rise before it needed help, how much of that wall might become window before it ceased to hold its own weight, and how a great space might be made to feel less like an enclosure and more like an invitation upward. Notre-Dame did not begin that conversation and did not end it, and it did not always speak the loudest within it. But it endured long enough and was tended carefully enough across the centuries to remain one of its clearest and most enduring voices, still standing at the center of Paris, still carrying forward a debate that had begun long before its own foundations were laid, and that would continue, in ways no one could yet foresee, into a night still decades away. That night, still decades away, arrived in the end on an ordinary evening in spring, when the city around the cathedral was going about its business much as it had for centuries, unaware that anything unusual was beginning at all. It was the 15th of April in the year 2019, and Paris was doing what Paris does at that hour, moving through its streets and cafes and its long golden light, while above the transept of Notre-Dame, in the space beneath the roof that almost no visitor ever saw, something had begun to smolder among the old and ancient timber. The alarm sounded first, a little after 6 in the evening, and was investigated, and found nothing, in the way that alarms sometimes do, and then sounded again some minutes later, and this time what was found could not be mistaken for anything ordinary. By then the fire had already found what it needed in that high, hidden attic, in beams that had been resting there since long before anyone living could remember, dry with the accumulated centuries, and it began to move through them with a speed that the structure itself, for all its careful engineering, had no way to resist. What followed is best told plainly, without the language of catastrophe, because the plain facts carry their own weight without embellishment. The fire spread along the length of the roof timber that framing carpenters and their masters had once called the forest. That vast lattice of oak beams cut from trees that had stood, by some later estimates, since the earliest years of the cathedral's own construction, each one hauled and shaped and raised into place by hands whose names had long since been forgotten, even as their work endured above the vaults for 8.5 centuries. That timber had survived revolutions and neglect and restoration, and 2 world wars fought within reach of the city, had survived every century's changing fashions in architecture and every century's indifference and renewed devotion. And on this evening, it did not survive the fire that found it. Witnesses gathered along the riverbanks and the bridges as the light began to fail, watching smoke rise first in thin grey columns and then thicken into something that blotted out the evening sky above the towers. And the watching itself became, in its own way, a kind of vigil, wordless and enormous, the sort that a city holds without deciding to hold it. Sometime after 7 in the evening, the spire that Eugène Viollet-le-Duc had raised in the 19th century, slender and gilded and rising above the crossing where the 4 arms of the cathedral met, began to lean very slowly in a manner that those watching from below described afterward with a strange calm, as though the mind could not quite process what the eye was reporting. It held its shape a moment longer than seemed possible, and then it did not hold, and it came down into the burning roof beneath it, gone in a matter of seconds after standing for a matter of centuries, or in the spire's own case, after standing for not much more than 150 years, itself a replacement for an earlier spire lost to weather and time, now itself lost to fire. The image of its fall was recorded by hundreds of cameras from hundreds of angles, held by hands that did not entirely believe what they were filming, and it would become, in the days and weeks that followed, the single image by which the whole event was remembered, though it was only one moment within a longer night whose full danger was not yet known even to those standing closest to it. What the assembled crowds along the Seine could not see, and could not have known from the outside, was the work already underway inside the cathedral and upon it, where firefighters of the Paris Fire Brigade, numbering in the hundreds before the night was through, were engaged in a task that asked for patience and calculation as much as courage. The greater danger, once the roof timber was fully alight and the spire had fallen, was not only that fire would consume what remained above the vaults, but that the 2 great bell towers at the western end, each holding bells whose combined weight ran into many tons, might themselves be compromised by heat and by the collapse of masonry around them, and that their fall, if it came, would very likely bring down much of what still stood. It was this possibility, more than any other, that shaped the decisions made through the night, as commanders weighed how to fight a fire inside a structure whose stone had never been built to withstand flame of this scale, and whose narrow stairways and ancient timber framing made any direct assault on the burning roof itself a matter of extreme risk to the men who might attempt it. The choice made, and carried out through the hours that followed, was one of contained and careful sacrifice, to let the roof and its remaining timber burn, since little could be done to save what fire had already claimed, and to direct every effort instead toward the towers, the vaults, and the stone shell that held the whole structure together. Firefighters climbed into the northern tower and worked at close range against heat that must have been considerable, playing water not at the flames consuming the roof so much as at the stone and structure around it, cooling what could be cooled, watching for any sign that the towers themselves were beginning to fail. Others worked from ladders and platforms raised from the plaza below, and still others moved through the nave and the side chapels beneath the vaults, working to protect what could still be reached from the water and debris falling from above, and to prepare, if it came to it, for a rescue of what the cathedral held rather than the building that held it. There was little in their work that resembled the drama that later accounts sometimes lent it. It was, by the description of those present, slow and methodical and exhausting, carried out through a night that stretched past midnight and toward dawn, men and women moving with the deliberate calm that dangerous work of this kind requires, because haste in such circumstances kills as readily as fire does. Inside, while the roof burned above them, a smaller effort was underway to remove what could be carried. The crown of thorns, kept among the cathedral's most venerated relics and displayed only on certain days of the liturgical calendar, was taken out by hand along with other treasures held within the building, moved through smoke and uncertain footing to the safety of the Hôtel de Ville and later to the Louvre, carried by clergy and firefighters working together in a manner that later accounts noted with something close to wonder, given the danger of the passage. Other objects, too heavy or too fixed to move, were left to whatever fate the building itself would meet. Among them the great organ at the western end, built up over centuries and containing pipework and mechanism, far too large and too integrated into the structure to be carried anywhere. And the 3 rose windows, each one older than almost anything else in France, still standing in its original place and function. Each one now sitting directly beneath a roof that no longer existed to protect it. By the time the fire was declared under control, in the hours before dawn, it had burned for very nearly 15 hours from first alarm to final containment. And what it left behind told its own story of what had held and what had not. The roof and the timber forest beneath it was gone entirely, reduced to ash and scattered fragments across the vaults below. The spire was gone, but the vaults themselves, the great stone ribs that 13th century masons had closed high above the nave and transept, had held, for the most part, against the collapse of burning timber falling directly upon them. A testament less to any single design decision than to the simple mass and geometry of stone assembled by builders who had understood, without the language of modern engineering, how weight could be carried and thrust, resolved along a curve of carefully cut voussoirs. Where a section of vaulting did give way, near the crossing, it did so in a controlled and limited manner, and even there the fall did not bring down what stood around it. The rose windows, feared lost through much of the night, were found in the grey light of morning still holding the greater part of their medieval glass, scorched at their edges by heat and smoke, but not shattered, their tracery and their coloured panes intact enough to be assessed, in the days that followed, as saved rather than lost, an outcome that struck those who examined them as something closer to fortune than certainty. The towers held, the great bells held, silent in the smoke, but undamaged in their frames. The facade, weathered by 8 centuries of Parisian air and revolution and restoration, stood as it had stood, marked now with soot but otherwise unbroken. When morning came, the cathedral that emerged from the smoke was recognizably itself, and also, in a way, its centuries of visitors would have found strange to witness, suddenly open to the sky in a manner it had not been since long before its roof was first raised. Ash lay across the stone floor and settled into the carved detail of the portals outside, a fine grey coating over surfaces that had known dust and grime and candle smoke for 860 years, but never quite this particular residue. The plaza before the western facade, usually filled from early morning with visitors and pilgrims and the ordinary traffic of a living city, stood empty behind barricades, and the streets nearby carried the smell of smoke long after the flames themselves were out. The bells, which had rung across the city for centuries, marking hours and feast days and moments of both mourning and celebration, were silent, and that silence, more than any single image of the burning roof or the falling spire, seemed to register most sharply among those who lived within hearing of them. A city that had grown so accustomed to the cathedral's presence that it had ceased, in the way of familiar things, to fully notice it, discovered on that morning how large a space it had occupied, and how strange the skyline looked with its spire gone and its roofline broken open to the sky. In the days that followed, the full accounting of what had survived and what had been lost continued, carried out by engineers and conservators who moved carefully through a structure whose stability could not yet be fully trusted, checking stone by stone what the fire and the water and the falling debris had left behind. The verdict, arrived at slowly and stated with the same caution that had characterized every stage of the night itself, was that the cathedral had been gravely wounded, but had not fallen, that its stone had done, in the moment it was most needed, precisely what its builders had asked of it 8.5 centuries before, carrying weight and resisting collapse through geometry alone, without any promise from those who first shaped it, that fire of this kind would ever come. Notre-Dame stood open to the sky, stripped of the roof and spire that had sheltered it since the age of Viollet-le-Duc and long before him. But it stood, and in the plain fact of its standing, in the vaults that had held, and the windows that had endured, and the towers that had not fallen, the cathedral had already begun, without ceremony and without any decision made by those who watched it, to write the next chapter of its own long history, one that would now include not only its rising and its centuries of use, but this single wounding night and everything that would follow in the long work of answering it. In the weeks that followed, before any scaffold rose or any stone was cut, the work that had to be done was not yet a work of hands at all, but a work of decision, and it proved in its own quiet way to be as demanding as anything the builders of stone and timber would later undertake. The fire had left behind a wound that could be measured in tons of fallen lead and in the black char that marked where the spire had stood. But it had also left behind a question that no engineer's report could answer by itself. And that question was simply this: what now should Notre-Dame become? The cathedral had survived, its towers upright, its rose windows intact, its great vaults having done what vaults are built to do, catching the burning weight of the roof before it could fall further and shatter the space below. But the roof and the spire were gone, and in their absence there opened, for a time, a debate that reached far beyond the banks of the Seine, drawing in architects and historians, clergy and politicians, and ordinary citizens who had never given much thought to roof trusses or spire geometry until the night they watched both disappear into smoke. The debate, when it came, did not resolve itself quickly, and those who hoped for an immediate and unanimous answer were disappointed by how long the question was allowed to remain open. Almost as soon as the embers had cooled, voices arose calling for something new to rise in place of what had burned, arguing that a cathedral 8.5 centuries old could not simply repeat itself forever, that each age had left its mark upon Notre-Dame, and that the 21st century should be permitted to leave its own. An international design competition was proposed, and for a time it seemed possible that the spire itself, that slender needle of oak and lead that Viollet-le-Duc had raised in the middle of the 19th century, might be replaced not by its own likeness, but by something else entirely, something built of glass or steel, or forms that no medieval mason could have imagined. Architects submitted visions of spires that seemed to hover rather than stand, of roofs planted with gardens, of crystalline structures meant to catch light in ways the old lead and timber never could. These were not idle proposals, and they were argued with real conviction, for the case for reinterpretation was not without its own logic. A cathedral, after all, is not a museum piece frozen at a single moment. It is a building that has always changed, and to insist that only the forms of the past may ever return to it was, in the eyes of some, to mistake the nature of the very tradition they claimed to honor. Against this stood another conviction, quieter perhaps, but in the end more persuasive, and it was rooted less in aesthetic argument than in something closer to memory and grief. The image of Notre-Dame that had lived in the minds of those who loved it, whether they had ever set foot in Paris or only seen its silhouette in photographs, was an image inseparable from the spire that had just fallen and from the steep grey roofline that had framed it. That spire was itself a 19th century addition, not the original work of the medieval builders whose names have not survived. But by the time of the fire, it had stood for more than a century and a half, long enough to become, in the eyes of the world, simply Notre-Dame itself, indistinguishable from the cathedral's own historical identity, rather than felt as a later insertion upon it. To lose it, and then to replace it with something wholly new, however elegant, would be to sever a thread of continuity that had already survived war and revolution and the ordinary erosions of time. And for many who weighed the question, that severing seemed a loss too great to accept. in exchange for whatever novelty might be gained. There was, too, a practical dimension to the argument, for the cathedral's stone vaults and structure had been designed to carry a particular kind of roof, at a particular weight and pitch, and to impose upon them some radically different modern form risked consequences that could not be fully foreseen, however confident the engineering behind it. In the end, after months of public argument conducted in newspapers, in the halls of government, and in the quieter correspondence between architects and historians, the decision came down in favor of memory over invention. The French government determined that the roof and spire would be rebuilt to their appearance immediately before the fire, which meant, in practice, that Viollet-le-Duc's 19th century design, the same slender spire ringed with copper statues of the apostles, the same steep timber roof beneath its covering of lead, would rise again in something close to its exact prior form. It was not, those who made the decision were careful to note, a choice to pretend the fire had never happened, nor a claim that this was the only form the cathedral had ever worn or ever could wear. It was, rather, a choice to restore what living memory and photographic record could still recall with confidence, to rebuild not a fantasy of the medieval past, but the cathedral as it had stood, complete only days before the flames took it. The choice carried its own quiet irony, since Viollet-le-Duc's own 19th century restoration had itself been controversial in its time. Accused by some contemporaries of inventing a spire the medieval cathedral had never possessed in quite that form. Now that same disputed edition was being restored in its turn, as if to say that even a restoration, once it has stood long enough and been loved long enough, becomes part of the true history of the building it was made to serve. With the question of design settled, the work of assembling the means to answer it began, and here the story of Notre-Dame's rebuilding became, for a time, a story told not in one city, but across an entire world. Donations arrived from governments, from corporations, from private citizens who gave what they could, some sums vast and some modest, until the total pledged toward the cathedral's restoration reached into the hundreds of millions of euros, drawn from more than 150 countries. But money alone could not raise a spire, and what the effort required beyond funds was something rarer. Hands that still knew crafts many had assumed were dying, and materials gathered with the same patience the medieval builders themselves had once shown. Stonemasons were called back to work in the cathedral's own on-site workshops, carving replacement blocks to match, course by course, the limestone that had stood for centuries. Metalworkers were sought who could still forge iron by hand in the old manner, since modern welding, however strong, could not always replicate the flexibility and behavior of wrought iron under the stresses a medieval structure was built to bear. Glass workers examined the rose windows and the smaller openings for damage from heat and smoke. Foresters, quarry workers, riggers and scaffolders were drawn from across France and beyond, until the cathedral's close and the square before it became, once again, something like the crowded, purposeful worksite it must have been 8.5 centuries before, though now lit by electric floodlight rather than torch and lantern, and watched not by a medieval city, but by a world following its progress through television and photograph. Among all the tasks that this assembled effort faced, none proved more delicate nor more freighted with meaning than the search for timber large enough to recreate what had once been called, with a kind of affectionate awe, the forest. That name had belonged to the original medieval roof structure, the vast lattice of oak beams that had spanned the nave and choir since the 13th century. Built from timber so plentiful that no one at the time thought to count the trees it required, though later estimates would suggest a number in the thousands, drawn from oak forests, whose descendants, in some cases, still stood in France centuries later. When Viollet-le-Duc rebuilt the roof in the 19th century, he had turned again to oak. following the medieval pattern as closely as the forests of his own century allowed. Now, after the fire had taken that structure entirely, the question was whether oak of sufficient size and quality could still be found at all, in an age when forests were managed differently than they had been in the 13th or even the 19th century, and when trees left to grow tall and straight for 200 years or more had become rare rather than ordinary. The search that followed carried foresters into woodlands across France, into private estates and public forests alike, looking for oaks that met exacting requirements. Trunks straight enough and thick enough to be milled into the great beams the roof would require. Trees old enough to have grown dense, strong wood, yet not so old that the heartwood had begun to weaken or hollow. It was not a search that could be conducted quickly, nor one that treated the forest as a mere quarry of raw material. Each tree selected was chosen individually, examined for its particular qualities, and in many cases marked by foresters who understood that felling it would end a growth that had continued, quietly and without hurry, since long before any of them had been born. Some of the oaks chosen had stood for centuries, planted by foresters of earlier generations who could not have known what building or what fire their trees might one day serve. In the end, several thousand oaks were selected from forests across the country, donated in many cases by private landowners, church properties, and the National Forestry Service, felled in careful sequence and seasoned before being brought to the carpenters who would shape them by hand and by traditional joinery into the same interlocking lattice that had sheltered the cathedral's stone vaults for the better part of 860 years. It was, in its way, as patient and as improbable an undertaking as anything the medieval builders themselves had attempted. A forest summoned once more from the soil of France to become, beam by beam, the roof that fire had taken.